Ben, is this going to be at code along speed or should we just try to watch and digest?
It could be. I mean, I feel like it probably would be useful. So even if I go over from stand-up time to class time, I imagine this would be useful. So I'll try and do it a little more slowly, and I'll start from scratch, more or less. Let me just make sure I'm looking at the right thing. So I don't want here. What do I want? Do I want here? No, I want here. Okay, so I already opened up Video Store Part 2. It's running over here. I changed a few things, like I centered it and I took those buttons out. I apologize for the fact that things were in a little bit of a sloppy state. I know that the inventory.json was not quite the one you wanted. There was the correct one in solutions, but the one in main did not reflect the fact that you have IDs now, although it's not too much of a difference, but also that there's like, extra information, including like a rating, for example. So this is what it looks like right now. And it's basic in that I can't, I'm seeing stuff, but clicking stuff doesn't do anything. So all I've really done with my starting point is I have this inventory.json. It represents the initial, data, the initial source of truth. And then it's sort of like I'm taking all that data, I'm passing it to these individual components, and they're responsible for turning that into an image. But ultimately, we're just rendering once, essentially. Let's see what that looks like. So our starting point, might as well start from the beginning. Here's my React root. I don't really need to touch that. I have some stuff in the CSS, but otherwise nothing to change here. Although I'll take out the strict mode just so I'm not rendering everything twice. But that shouldn't make a difference to what it looks like and how it functions right now. And then we see that first thing we render is app. That's the root of our project. So we click on that. And I see app asks for a single thing called homepage and also this JSON thing called inventory, which I have over here. And that's just a list of things. And each thing in the list represents a single movie title. And while I'm just providing it as a JSON file here, in the future or today, we're going to learn how you might, request this data from a backend. So maybe we'd be requesting this from our own backend, maybe another backend. But the JSON here is just to mock the fact that, well, you need to get data somehow. But once we're, closer to a real website, we wouldn't just have it as a JSON file. We'd be requesting it from a server. And the main reason for that is because the server can represent data that, is living. If updates were made to it, we could see those updates. Whereas this JSON file is sort of frozen. It represents data as it is now, but there's not much we can do with it. But this is what we're going to use as our source of truth right now. And it's just a local file. Then what do we do here? Well, I'm printing out the inventory. So, app is this element over here. Takes no props, as you can see. But app is a function. So this is that function running here, printing out the inventory. If I looked over here and I opened up the console, which, it's good to have that open generally when developing, I'll see I did print that out, just if I want to see what my data looks like. And then over here, I'm just returning some JSX. So just like normal, we got some JSX. I have, maybe an ID to match up to my CSS, but there's nothing really functional here. And then I have that homepage, which I'm passing one value to it called inventory. And because I know there was confusion here, let's actually look at this. So this on the left here represents the name of a single prop, a single property. This on the right here, and the reason it's surrounded in these curly brackets is because it represents a variable. So this inventory represents this, object that we got from here and that we're printing out over here. And it's just a regular JavaScript object. This inventory is a name that we're giving to homepage as one of its props. So if I name this XYZ, that would be totally valid. They don't have to be the same name. It's just convenient to name them the same thing so that when you move, you know, if you're drilling your props down and down and down, giving it the same name is an easy way to keep track of that. It's the same thing. But just to see that work, if I save this and I go into home page, wish that would stop popping up for me. So as we see, homepage takes props. So right now I'm saying props.inventory, but because of how I provided it, there is nothing on the props called inventory. There's only one thing on the props called XYZ. And maybe to see this as well, I'll, you know, pass something like 4. So if I were to look at my page render now, it'll likely be broken. Yeah, because it's attempting to look for something on an object that's not there. So cannot read properties of undefined. Line 8. Where it's breaking is right here because it says props. Okay, that's an object. Dot inventory. Well, that's not there, so that's undefined. Dot map. Undefined does not have something on it called map. So this will break. But let's just see what our props are before it breaks. So I'm printing those props. I'll refresh, make it a little easier to see. Another useful dev tool thing, you see here where it says default levels. If I click this, I could actually say, I don't want to see errors, let's say. So that cleans it up a little if I have a lot of errors, though you generally want to see the errors. So these are my props. My props have an X on it, a value 4, and an XYZ of the whole inventory. And that's because of how I named it. So X and XYZ, those are coming from here. And the reason why it's important that we note what's named here and here, as opposed to just looking here, is that I might have another home, like it doesn't make so much sense in this case, but maybe I have 2 home pages, right? And maybe this home page, okay, it takes the same prop XYZ equal to inventory, but maybe it takes a different thing called Y equal to, you know, 10. Well, now the props value over here, if I opened up that props, I would see, okay, it still has an XYZ on it with a certain value, but it doesn't have an X on it, but it does have a Y on it. So what props that component actually get, just like giving inputs to a function, you don't look at the definition of the function. You don't look at the parameters of the function to necessarily find out what's passed in, because some things might be passed in, some things might just be missing. They might be null or undefined. You look at where it's actually called. So it's almost like I'm calling homepage with 2 arguments, one called inventory, one called 10, and then in the body of the homepage, we're giving those the names X, Y, Z, and Y. But I don't want to do this, and I don't actually want an X there. And to make it simple for me, I'm going to call this the same thing as the name of the variable in this context, which is inventory. So now come back here, look here. Now, if I refresh, okay, there's one thing on the props. So props is an object, and the one thing on it is called inventory. Coming back here, I can say, well, you know, I did props.inventory here. That works totally fine. But sometimes people like to destruct that. So the first thing I might do is say const, you know, and ultimately, well, the first thing I might do is say props. So props is the thing I have, and that is an object. But if I want to destructure an object, I can say equal, you know, const, because we're declaring variables. And then I open up curlies like this to say, well, it's an object I'm destructuring. And now I want to pull off the names of any keys I want. And there's only one key on it called inventory. And now that, and it has to be spelled right if you're doing it this way. And then if I do that, now I don't have to say props.inventory. I could just say inventory, and that's useful if I'm working with a lot of props. So let's just make sure that still works. It does. And then one more thing you could do, which I like this pattern, but I was told last cohort this was confusing for people to see. You don't even have to do this, because right here, props is this same props. You can just move this definition, this destructuring right in there. And now you're saying, you know, because you're always getting that one argument props, you're just destructuring it right in here with the curlies and then the name of the keys that you want. And this is not a special syntax that, you know, is specifically to React. This works in JavaScript in general, just a useful pattern for what we're doing. So this will get us just that inventory prop. And then we're mapping it, and I'm looking at each item, which I'm calling underscore, underscore inventory item. I could do destructuring here too. If I know that's an object, I could just say title, image URL, copies available. But I'm doing it this way. I'm also taking that index because I want to give each item, because it's a list of things, I want to give each item a key. And then I'm passing all of this data in, and you'll notice that I'm just giving it the same name that it actually has, because that's kind of easier to work with. I'll call on you in a second, Chris. And going into inventory item, I pull all those off again. Maybe I would want to grab them like this and just put them in here. And if I do that and I save, once I get rid of this, it'll probably do that, which some people like this, because JavaScript doesn't care about white space. So that's a nice way of seeing all the things you're passing in. And then I'm just using those things. Okay, so that's everything for what we currently have now. So I'm going to stop for questions.
Okay.
Including,
Sorry, I got a ridiculous question. So I noticed you name it, I think it was homepage, you named it inventory. Can you change the scope to give it like another name, like inventory within one scope, and then maybe something else within another scope, and then have different variables for each scope of how you're using it? Or am I?
well, I can certainly do this. I can say, okay, here I called it inventory, right? That's the actual object. I could say, okay, well, in homepage, the name of the prop is XYZ. So this ultimately is being, because it's in the braces, is being interpreted for its value. And then it's being stored in what's essentially a variable on this object called props called XYZ. So by the time we get here, there's nothing called inventory anymore. It's called XYZ. And then I'd have to reference that here as XYZ. And so they have different names now in these two different contexts, but they still represent the same object.
Okay, so sorry. So if is there like a way you could flip a switch to have it take in one variable, or sort one name for a variable, and then uh you flip a switch and then it takes in another variable, so your whole page and its functionality completely changes based on the name changing within a switch, like dark mode and light mode, essentially.
Well, I think the way you would do that, let's say you had something like that. So I'm going to put these back. If you wanted to decide between light mode and dark mode, you wouldn't have it be based on the name of a variable. Instead, you'd have something like theme. Theme equals, maybe I would say theme type. And then maybe up here, maybe it's a use state, maybe it's something else. But for now, I'll just say const theme type equals light. And it could have been dark, but in this case, it's light. And so now there will be something passed into homepage called theme. Maybe I would say theme type if I really, just wanted it to be the same. Now in homepage, not only am I getting inventory, I'm also getting theme type. And now from there, I mean, just to see it, I would print out, theme type. And then maybe I would have something like this, where I would say like, let's actually see that, because that's pretty cool. So in index.css, maybe I'll say something like, we're only working with a home page. So the home page has a div on it called title container. And so maybe I'll go into index.css. I'll look for title container. Yeah, and maybe I have something like this, right? So title container, I see it doesn't have a background color. But basically I want to add a background color one way or another based on what it is. Maybe I would say like, light means a background color of white, and then dark means a background color of, Blanche. I just want like dark gray. I know it's there. I like that it says dark gray and dark gray EY in case like you're from America versus Canada. Ooh, I like dark orchid. Cool. Okay, so these are our two things. This is what light mode looks like. We'll actually make it like, can I get light pink? Yeah, there we go. Light pink is going to be my light background color. Dark orchid is my dark background color. Cool. So I have these two classes, light and dark. And then if I come back to home page here, I could say, without the theme type yet, I would say like, okay, class name title container will also class name light. And I'll save it. And now if I look here, that's what it looks like. That's my light mode. And maybe I'll change it right now, just hard code it to dark. That's my dark. Okay. So now what I might do, if I wanted to switch between these things, I might say like, okay, my theme type is going to look like light or dark, right? Because over here I said it's going to be light. It could be dark. And I'm passing it in like as a string. So what I'll do in here is say something like, okay, well, I have this class name. That's a string like any other. So I can surround it like this. Well, actually, it wants to be in these curlies because that's too advanced for it. But now it's still just title container and dark. But I could actually say, okay, actually, based on what that is, do something else. So if theme type is light, it'll now have a class light. If theme type is dark, it'll have a class dark. So let me save that. And I initially gave it light. So if I come back here, I'll see it is light. And now if I look at it, I see I have title container light. Now coming back here, I'm going to change that to dark, save that. That in here, you know, because it's passed in as a prop. Now it's actually going to be filled in as one of the class names. This should now be title container space dark. And we see that it is. So that is one way that you could choose something based on a value, but you're not going to do it based on the name of the prop. The name of the prop should be the same regardless. Its value should change.
Gotcha. Thanks.
Yeah. And if this is breaking some people's brains, I want to tell you, it's very reasonable you wouldn't have come up with this stuff itself. It's only looking easy because I've been doing this for a long time. But basically, we're just using regular JavaScript abilities in clever ways to get the behavior that we want. Okay, so I think this is still worth our time to do this, even though we've only just done, you know, we haven't done any of the use state stuff yet. But I think this will be worth our time to do this because there was some confusion yesterday, and these things do build on each other. And use state really is the most important one of these hooks. So looking at my video store, I have this home page. And how do I want this to work? Well, this is my home page. But I kind of want it so that when I click on one of these, make this a little smaller so I see everything. When I click on one of these, I want to make it so that I see a details panel. Well, the first thing I might do just to test it out, I might just make the details panel. And then after that, I might worry about making it work right with data. So before we even do a use state, let's make a details panel and just put it at the bottom of my home page. So the way I would do that is I'd make a new component. I'm going to give it a name, capital, like details panel, because that's how we tend to name components. And I just do my default, or sorry, export default function details panel. That's really what I wanted to call it. So let me update that name. And this would take props. Maybe none are passed in yet, but it would take props. And just to see it working, because I really like to just see things working first, I'll say h1 details panel. And of course, we're not going to see anything yet because while we created that component, we haven't, you know, integrated it anywhere. So coming back here, I look at my home page and I say, well, this is where I want it. I want it at the bottom, like after I have this list of all the titles. Down here, I want the details page. So first I'll import it just like any other component. So I'll import details panel and it knows where it is. It's at the same level. And I didn't provide it any props. So just right here, I'll say details panel, self-closing. And because I put some value in there, I can actually test, yes, we have a details panel. Cool. So at that point, I might say, well, I want this details panel to represent like a full one of these. So before I'm using any state, I'll do that. So coming back here, I might, say, well, what does details panel take? it's definitely going to take an inventory item. So, I have access to the whole inventory. Maybe I'll just pass it a single thing in that way. I'll say inventory item, and I'll spell that right. Inventory item. It's the name of my single prop. And what I'm going to pass it is not the whole inventory, but just the first one. And like I said, we don't have state yet, so this isn't going to be really reactive, but at least I'm getting the whole thing. And then in here, I have props here. I'll destructure it right in there and say inventory item. And now once again, to see that it's working, because it's good to check your work at each stage, I'll say console.log inventory item, make sure I'm getting something. Okay, let me refresh. Let me open my console here. And indeed, coming from details panel, we're seeing that whole details thing. And I basically just want to fill that in with this information. So I'm going to do it, quick and dirty where it's not going to look very good, but it'll have all the information. So let's see, I have a title, rating, image URL. So I actually, I have all these things I care about. I might want to just pull them off. So it's not just props that you can destructure. I could actually look at that inventory.json and say, okay, here are all the things we have. ID, title, image URL. And then I'm going to go here and I'm going to say, okay, take that individual inventory item. I actually want to destructure that. And what I want in there are, well, maybe I don't need the ID yet. So I'll just say title, image, URL, what was it? Copies available, total available. And these have to be spelled right, but it can't tell you about it. Rating and description. Rating, description. And that's going to do it nicely for me. And now I have access to all those things. So let me start working with it. First thing I might do is I might wrap this in these. And what does it look
I'm not gonna lie, you're going like a million miles a minute.
Sorry. So can I slow this down? Because I'm basically, I think we have a bit of an issue here in that, like, it's already 9. I don't want to spend like an hour working on this because we have other stuff to talk about, but it is, like, I haven't even gotten into the use state stuff. I'm just trying to do it like step by step. Is there like a better way I could do this?
I don't know. That was just me. If
Yeah.
some people were liking the pace, I was just like trying to code along with you, and I couldn't really keep up with you
Yeah.
switching screens. But
Right. Well, I think the issue there is that coding along can be pretty tough, especially if you're seeing something for the first time. Because I mean, I think we'll try and do that for today's thing. I think for today, I'm not going to really read the lecture content. It'll still be there, but I'll just walk through working with use states so that we can code along. But for this thing, I guess I want to get like a basic poll from the audience, which is something like, I think I can actually create a poll right now. No, I
I think
can't.
the general consensus was it's okay to power through because we'll have the recording to watch later.
Exactly, yeah. Okay, fair enough. Because all I want to do here is but yeah, Roger, I see you're saying you're struggling with React. I don't want people to be struggling too much with this, but yeah, I understand it's a lot to digest. But does this generally make sense how, like, I took app here, I took the inventory, and I passed it down to the homepage. And then in the homepage, I took inventory and I took a single thing off of it. And I passed that down to details panel as inventory item. And now details panel has that data. So it can like work with it.
I think it makes sense, and I hate how easy it looks right now until I get behind the computer.
Yeah, and it only looks easy because part of the nature of the tech industry, but really probably every job, is that you end up specializing. So like, if I had to do Django, I'd be worse than most of you. I never touch backend stuff just about, because people pay me to be good at front end, and I can do the front end stuff very quickly. And there's someone else on the team who can do the back end stuff quickly. So 90% of the time, they just want me working on front end. And so I've built up these muscles where I don't think about it too much, but I understand that if this is new, it's a lot. But I'd say I'm willing to go to 9:30 doing this stuff. So let's just continue with this, where I'm going to say, okay, right now we're just building out the details panel, and we've not touched state at all. So let's try and do this together. Like, I'm just building this out. How would I do this? Like, how do I, render my title, for example? Like, let's say the title is the H1 here, or H2. Like, how do I render that title?
Can we can we just throw title in as an H2 and then, rating is as H3, image
sure, yeah.
as a image tag with the source.
Yeah. But of
Just
course,
throw
if
them
I
all
do
in line
this,
like you imported them in.
if I
In
say
the
something
curly
like
braces.
this, what do I expect to happen? What do I expect to render?
Just the words. So we need to throw them
Exactly.
in curly braces.
Right. So I'll put these in curly braces. Here's my rating, or here's my title. Here's my rating. Like you said, with the image, I might have an image, and I think that's self-closing, but it needs a source, and that source is what would be image source, image URL, I called it. Let's just ignore these copies total. Actually, might as well I'll put them in there like this. I'll say copies available, and then this slash here is just, text again. Total available. And then finally, I would have maybe another P, and that's where I'd have my description. Let's see what that looks like. Yeah, so we're showing this whole thing for everything. So clicking on this stuff still doesn't make a difference. All right, so now we're finally at the point where we want to integrate state. And I think this is a good approach where you just start by making everything visible, and then you say, well, how do I make it react to state? So the first thing I want is that when I click one of these, it's going to, the page itself will be aware it was clicked on for the sake of redoing this. And what I did here is that in order to render this, what it needed was the index. So it ultimately needs that item, but the unique data, because we're passing, a specific item, but we're not changing the inventory at this point. We just want to know which index was clicked or which ID was clicked, but we'll just use index for right now. So which one of these was clicked? Well, first we have to create some kind of on-click handler. So if I come back here, maybe the first thing I would do is go into my, I'll close some of these. I'll go into my inventory item, and that I want to have an on-click handler, and I'm going to put it on the whole div. So anything can respond to being clicked on, and I want to make it so that not only if I click here, but also if I click here or here, that's going to register as a click on the whole thing. So I'm going to put an on click here, and I might as well break it out into its own function. So I'll say on click handler. Over here, I'll actually define that const on click handler, and that equals a function. That function would take an event, but I'm not actually going to use it, so I don't even need it. And then I'm going to do something in response. What am I going to do? I'm going to say console.log. And that's where I might want to say, like, for right now, I'll say this item clicked. So now if I click on one of these, it says this item clicked, but it's going to say that for all of them. So how do I know the unique ID? So let's start there. Coming back here, I want each inventory item to know about which one of these inventory items it represents. And in this case, actually, each one has an ID, and that ID is identical to the index. So we could probably utilize that feature. So coming back to, where was it? Homepage. When I make an inventory item, this is what I'm doing, but inventory item has an ID on it. So how do I pass that unique ID down to each inventory item?
Create a variable equal inventory item dot ID.
Yeah, so inventory item already has something on it called ID. but we want to pass that to React. So when I do this inventory item.id, depending on the inventory item, is going to be 0, 1, 2, or 3. And I want that to be something that my inventory item component is aware of. So I pass it down as a prop. So now each inventory item will have an ID. Let me go into my inventory item. First thing I do is say, well, there's also an ID coming in. Now I could say this item clicked, comma, ID, and I'll print out the specific ID. So let me check if that works, because I like to check at each stage. So when I click this one, 0 was clicked, 2 was clicked, 3 was clicked, 1 was clicked. Cool. It's aware of its index. Great. Coming back here, I'm going to say, okay, it's aware of its index. And maybe I might create a use state at some point now to say, I want to keep track of which one was clicked. But the thing is, if I define my use state at the level of inventory item, only that inventory item is aware. So really, it's this page where I show the details panel that I want to know which item was selected, right? So that tells me that homepage is a good place to create that use state. I could have also created it in app, because anything you create at a top or at a parent level, you can pass down to a child, but app doesn't need to know about it. It's homepage that's the first one that needs to know which of those things was clicked, because it's responsible for the details panel. So that's going to tell me, okay, here's where I'm going to import my use state. And I'll get rid of this, and I'll do the classic use state pattern. And I want this to represent the index of the thing that was clicked on. And in order to do that, I'm going to say like, okay, the default index will be null. Maybe I would say -1 or something, but this is going to represent nothing has been clicked on. And I'm going to call that selected ID and set selected ID. And because I want to know what it is, I'm going to print it out at this level. And now my question is, if inventory item is going to be the one actually doing the updating, so this on-click handler just prints it out right now, but I actually want this to change the ID so homepage is aware of it. How do I make it so that inventory item is capable of updating that selected ID?
You need to pass in selected ID and set selected ID into inventory item.
Yep. But the thing is, inventory item doesn't even need to know which ID is selected, right? Because it has its own index. All it needs is this ability to update on click, set selected ID. So I don't even have to pass selected ID down. I can just pass. What?
Would you use context, or okay, you pass it through?
Well, I could use context eventually, but use context is more than I need right now. Use state is enough, and props is the built-in way of passing things around, so I'll do that. And I saw you asked a question in the chat, Roger, I'll get to in a second. So set selected ID is now another thing coming into inventory item, and I'm just naming it the same thing because it is this function. So in inventory item, I'm grabbing that as well. And now this on-click handler, I want to say when someone clicks that item, call set selected ID on whatever the ID is. And that happens at this level, where this is where set selected ID is being called with its new value ID. But because it's defined at this level, this whole component should re-render when it changes, and I'll be able to see that the right thing was printed. So let me just check that that works. I'm going to click this. Okay, we saw 2 and it was printed from the homepage. We saw 0 and it was printed from the homepage. And we can ignore this details panel thing right now. I'm actually going to stop printing those other things just to clean it up a bit. So we don't need to print this right now. We don't need this. Well, I'll leave that there. We do want to print this. I think we also had something in details panel. We don't want to print this. So I'll check that once again. Not printing anything. It's saying null right now to say nothing was selected. Now something was selected, and it's the right thing. So that's the very basics of use state in terms of something happened and I want, a parent to be informed. I see Roger's asking a question. Ben, if you had a button in that div and you made the entire div clickable, would it render the specific button useless? No. That's a good question. If I come back to inventory item, you're saying if I had like a button here, I had a button here and I say click me and I made an on click, I could give it its own function on click button, right? And then I'll put that over here. It's good to see this actually happen. So I have two things now. I have my on click handler, which is what happens when the whole thing is clicked. And then I have const on click button, and that's what happens when just that button is clicked.
But
It's
both of
okay.
the
You don't have
functions
to
are gonna,
deviate too much from the lesson. I asked that question a while back when you're putting the method on the div. I was just curious.
Okay.
Thank you.
Well, no, I think this is worth seeing because it has to do with that stop propagation thing we saw yesterday. So it's a pretty good question. If I come back here now, I'm gonna refresh this and I'm gonna see I have these buttons. Let me click it. Two things happened. One, the button was clicked. Two, it actually, so the button was clicked, but because the button's inside of the div, after the button was clicked and we saw its callback, eventually the div was clicked and we saw its callback, which did something. So if we wanted to prevent that, that's where we would say, okay, on click button, we actually take that event and we say event.stop propagation, I think, right? Does it know about it? I think so. So now I'm going to refresh. I click me, just the button is clicked. Now, if I click anywhere else, it knows. So that is a thing to know about in terms of events bubbling up and stop propagation, preventing it from bubbling up. Okay. So I'll come back here. I guess I'll take that button out because I don't really want it. So currently, coming back here, I click and homepage is aware that something changed. So what I want to do now is I say, okay, in homepage, currently I'm passing the inventory item like this. Well, I don't want that to be the 0th always. Instead, I want that to be whatever, what was it? Selected ID was. So now inventory item will get inventory and then whatever the ID is as its index. So now I'll come back here and I believe that is what I want. So it's not, we're getting some errors, which is why I don't want to turn off my errors. What's the problem? Cannot destructure property title of inventory item as it is undefined. So what's the issue? Oh, right. That's a very good point. So the problem is that selected ID initially is null. What is inventory, index null? That doesn't make sense. So it breaks. And that's why we sometimes do this pattern where I wrap it in the curlies and I say only if selected ID has, a non-null value. So I'll say selected ID does not equal null. If that's true, then render this details panel. So now this should work. It's initially null. We initially don't see anything. I click something. Okay, now I see it. I click something else. Now I see that. So that's what we were hoping you would get to yesterday. I understand that we can make it clearer so that we actually do get to it. I see in the chat, Eric is asking the difference between bubbling and propagation. I think it's the same thing. Stop propagation is what the function is named. I think the word bubbling is just a colloquial term programmers use to describe that process. Like it's propagating upwards. And so we call that bubbling. But I don't think bubbling is an official term anywhere. Like if you go to MDN, they're not going to call it bubbling.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. So I hope that was useful. It's 8:20 right now. I do want to give you guys a 10-minute break before we start. I hope that was enough. We obviously could add in another feature of like that, checkout return button thing, and that, involves a little more effort. But for right now, I think this is good. So I'm going to give you guys a 10-minute break right now. We're going to come back 9:30, and what we're going to talk about today is our second hook, or our third, I guess, if you count use context, our third hook, which is useEffect, and that's going to help us talk to a server. Cool. So I'm happy this got people up to speed. Yeah, let's take that real 10-minute break right now. I'm going to stop sharing. I'll pause recording for a moment. And wait a minute. Yeah, I am recording. Okay, so let's look at what we're going to be doing today. This is the actual markdown doc for today. It's pretty thorough, but I think I've realized this is walking through these very large docs. We end up going at a pace that is not the most helpful. And I feel like it's better to work backwards, where we start with what we're trying to accomplish and then build up in terms of the practical stuff before touching anything, more theoretical that seemingly needs to be a stepping stone, but it's maybe just wasting your time. So the first thing I want to do, okay, well, I have this plan here. I guess I have that here. This is my plan to just go through stuff with you. So we'll go through each one of these one at a time. But the first thing is demo what we're building towards. So if I come over here, you'll see I have a project that's already running. Hold on, wait, am I sharing? Can you guys see me?
You're not sharing your screen.
No,
I'm
you're
not sharing
not.
my screen. What am I talking about? There we go. Okay, so now you guys can see my screen, right? Okay, so this is the document like normal, and you can read it, but I don't think I'm going to be working from it today because there's just a lot of information, and I don't know that that's been the best approach. So this is a different document that I just made. You don't have access to this, but this is just the plan for what I'm going to do today. And step one is to demo what we're building towards. So right here, I have a really simple React app called Pokey Image Viewer. And the way it works is that I could type into here, I could say like Pikachu, and I click search, and I wait for a second, and then I see this image of Pikachu. I can do that again with Squirtle. I click search, and I see an image of Squirtle. And then let's say I put a Pokemon that's not in there, like the famous Missing No. I don't know if that's something people know about anymore, but that was a big deal when I was in the 7th grade. I try and it says request failed with status code 404. Okay, so this input here is regular HTML, and we're using React to create this page. But when I'm doing that search, I can look in here. That search, I suppose I have to refresh to see it. So these are all the, all the things my site might rely on. But if I do Pikachu and I click search, okay, I actually made a request of some kind. That's what this XHR means. That's this request. It's a GET request. It's a GET request to this URL. Looks like it came back with a 200, and there was some kind of response. So this was the response. And then what I did from there, once I got the response, is I looked at sprites, I looked at front default, I think, and then I took this URL and I made this URL the source of an image. Let's just grab that. So what I've added to my React app is that I'm able to talk to a specific API. So through this URL, HTTP, / Pokemon, etc. Oh, sorry, up here / Pikachu, I was able to get some data. So that's this API right here. And here's an example of running that request, and it returned an object. And then I dug into that object to get a specific thing I wanted, this front default. And that is actually an image, which we can see right here. And then I displayed that image on my page. So what we're going to be adding today is the ability to work with a third-party API. And that won't ultimately be any different than working with your own API, because by the design of the internet, it doesn't know whether you own a given URL or not. An API is a way of exposing some, data, exposing a database through these URL patterns in order to retrieve some data, and then your front end can work with that URL to grab that data and then use it to fill in the page. So that is what we are going to be building towards. But instead of showing you the contents of this or the implementation, because it's a little complex, let's just build up step by step. Looking at the chat right now. Jesse, I remember Pogs. I have a great Pogs story. Pogs were around when I was in the 1st grade, and my brother and sister were in the 3rd and 5th grade, respectively. And they got word first that Pogs were on their way out. So they gave me all their Pogs. And then I was a very entrepreneurial 1st grader. So I'm like, oh, these are on the way out. Let me sell them. So I just sold Pogs in 1st grade, and I made, some good money because people were buying Pogs. And I don't know, I was born in 1987. And the Pogs with an 8-ball or a skull on it were the most expensive ones. Or that's what I sold for the most. For some reason, everyone decided 8-ball or a skull, that's valuable. But that's not what we're here to discuss. We're not making a Pogs website. We could. Okay. So what I'm going to do now is let's start a project from scratch so we can actually build this up in the most basic way. So coming back here, my plan. So we just demoed this Pokey search, and then I showed you the third-party API that we're using. Now let's look at how we do that with this thing called useEffect. But before we ever talk to an API, let's just see how useEffect works on its own. So what I'm going to do is, let me open this up a little. Oh, I see I have it open in 2 places. I'm going to open this up a little. Where do I want to go? We're ultimately going to want to look at a website, but the first thing I'm going to do is open up my iTerm, and maybe I'll go to uniform assignments. I'll just put it there, and I'm going to create a brand new Vite project. So npm create Vite, and I'll name this useEffect demo. And I'll choose React, and I'll choose JavaScript, and now we're ready to go. Go into useEffect demo. Let me open it up. I'll do everything from there. So now that I'm in here, first thing I want to do is npm install, so I can install my dependencies, which are just these dependencies right now: React and React DOM, and Vite itself as a dev dependency. So now that I've done that, I should be able to do npm run dev. And that's that server 5173. So now I'll come back here and, okay, I already see it. So cool. It's that site we know and love. I can click count and make it go up and down. I'm going to get rid of the default content just so that we're starting with a blank page. So coming back here, the only thing I'm going to change, maybe to make it simple, I'll take out that strict mode again. And then I'm not going to delete any files. I'm just going to go into app.jsx, and I'll essentially get rid of its content. Let me get rid of most of that content. Okay, so now we have this basic div. We're exporting it. We're not using any of this stuff, so I guess I'll get rid of it for now. But I'm not going to get rid of the use state, because I'm going to ultimately be using some of that. But coming back to my page, it's blank. So we're back at a starting point. Okay. So useEffect. We still have use state here. Suppose we could use it. Let's just put something on our page. Let's say we said const, just like we had it a second ago, count, set count. equals use state 0. I'm not going to update it at all, but just right in here, I'll print the count. Okay. Now, if I look at my page, it's a little hard to see, but there's a 0. Maybe I want to shift everything to the center. Class name app, is that in here? No, it looks like it's in here, which we are including. Is it there? I don't know. I'm going to add a, for app, I'm going to say what? Justify content. I'll actually show this. So you see how we have a class name app? So if I come back here and I look at my dev console, I might look at my elements. I'll open up my body, open up my div, and there's my class app, right? That's where the 0 is. So this is some of the cool stuff you could actually do in here that, let's say I was saying like, hey, I know I want to use like Flexbox in some way. So the first thing I do is say display flex, but then notice this, flex actually gave me this button here once I did that, which is a Chrome DevTools thing. If I click that, now it's telling me all these different options, and it's kind of helping me understand what they do. So I might say, well, I want this centered. Is that align content? Is that justify content, align items? It looks like, because my flex direction is the default, which is row, I want justify content, and that's going to tell me left or right. And I want to center it. So which one is that? Space between flex start center. There we go. That doesn't seem to be centering it. I wonder why not. Maybe I also want align content centered. No, I feel like, okay, so it turns out it's not working. I was hoping this would center it for me.
Would align text work?
It would, yeah. I think, right, the issue there is that it doesn't have any children. It's just the actual thing itself. So if I said align, is it align text or what is
Text
it?
align, sorry.
Text align, yeah, easy to forget these. Not even that's not working. I wonder why that is. Shouldn't it be maybe because I want like display block? Why is it? Could be maybe because of some of the stuff that's being given to me already, but doesn't look like that does much. I'm not sure why this div is only wrapping itself. This isn't the most important thing, but yeah, if I said display flex, so then the children of this perhaps would now be aligned in the way I expect. No, it doesn't seem to be working. Maybe not worth our time right now to figure out why not. Okay, so honestly, it probably is kind of hard to see all the way there. Maybe I'll make this an H1 at the very least so we can see it. I don't even have a class called app. Ignore this right now. Okay, so how does this look? Looks good enough. You can see the 0. That's all I want. We have something on the page. I see Francisco is saying it's the display flex. The div isn't crossing the entire screen, height, width. Yeah, I mean, it's something we could figure out, but for now, let's just see. What we care about is less style right now and more just, functionality. So let's start seeing that. So the first thing I'm going to do, in addition to this use state, I have another hook, and it's called useEffect. Okay, so what is a useEffect? If I read this, what does it say? It accepts a function that contains imperative, possibly effectful code. So ultimately, and we have a link to it here. I can look at the reference there. So React is going to tell us all about useEffect, and all these different ways we could use it. So ultimately, I'm going to want to use this to talk to a specific URL. But before I do that, let's just see how useEffect itself works. So it's called useEffect because it's there to work with an effect. In other words, something that is outside of its control, something that happens in response to some cause. So let's see how that works. I have this useEffect, and just like my other hooks, it has to be at the top level. So here's my useEffect. It is a function. So I open it up like this. We see it takes a couple of things, but the first thing is required. So that question mark next to the second thing, depths, means it's optional, but that first thing is a required, and it's a callback function. So what we're going to give it is a function that takes no arguments and does something. And in here, I'll just say console.log effect. Save. Okay. So let's look at our app. I'm going to refresh. I'm going to look at my console. There, we printed effect. So what happened there exactly? Let's explain. Coming back here, if I look in main, I have the app, right? So I'm rendering the app. Here's my app. By rendering it, that means I run this function. When I run this function, I created some state called count, and that happened before we ever hit this render, before we ever actually print any JSX. So count is 0 by the time we get here, and that returns this h1 with a 0 inside of it. Now useEffect, it takes this callback function, it doesn't call it right away. After we render, that's when it actually calls the useEffect. So what I might do in here is I might say, okay, let me print out the count. So now we're going to render this h1, and then after it renders, we're going to run this function, and all this function does is print out the count. Let's see that. We render the function. I guess a way to see this, and then we printed the 0, a way to see that it's happening in this order is that, let's say the first thing I do is I say console.log rendering app. So we're going to print this right before we actually return the h1. So the first thing that's going to happen is it's going to print out rendering app, and then after the render is done, that's when this function gets called, and it'll print out the count. Okay, refresh. First we render app, then we see that value 0. So this is the most basic version of useEffect. useEffect happens in response to a render. So because is a render or a re-render, the effect is whatever function you pass to it. It doesn't have to be calling a server. So right now we're just printing something out in response. Okay, so now we might say, well, what if we wanted to make it so after we render, maybe we print the count as it currently is after the render, and then in response to that, let me update the count. So I'll say first print the count, then update the count to count +1. So I know you probably don't know the answer, but part of thinking about this stuff, part of being a programmer is basically before you run the code saying, what do I think might happen? So what we've established is that after a render, we run the useEffect. So we render this, means we print this, and then we return this. So that's what it looks like. Then after that, we run this. So can anyone tell me what is going to happen when we run this?
Make an infinite loop.
Whoever's talking, you're very low.
Gonna make an infinite loop.
Yeah, basically. Good guess. So basically, we're going to print count, which is 0. Then we're going to set the count to 1. So now count will equal 1. That triggers a re-render. Now this h1 will be re-rendered, or I mean, we'll actually reprint console.log. The h1 will be re-rendered with the value 1. That re-render triggers useEffect again. useEffect will print out 1 and it'll set it to 2, repeating the cycle over and over and over again. So let me see that happen. I hope I don't break my whole browser doing that. Yeah, it's going nuts, right? And in fact, you're noticing it's not even printing stuff, and I've lost control. Like if I click, it's not responding. I'm going to have to close this out. Yeah. So that's kind of an important point there. I probably am going to want to end this too before I restart it. I created an infinite loop there because useEffect triggers on every render. It triggers after every render. So what I actually want to do in most cases is not just give it this first argument, which is a function. So let's look at this again. The first argument is the effect. It's an effect callback. The second argument is this thing called deps. It's optional. So because it's optional, it might just be undefined, but otherwise it's a dependency list. And we can guess from that that it's a list. And we see here, we say, if present, effect will only activate if the value in the list changes. So a dependency list will tell me if this value changed, then I want you to run this useEffect again. And so the simplest thing we could give it is actually an empty list. And the empty list means only run this on that first render and then never again, because there's nothing to watch for changes. So this will only run on the first render. Coming back here, I'll look at it. Oh, sorry, I want to run it again. Great. Coming back here, open that back up. Right, so we see the number 1. If I inspect it, my page is still working. We rendered app. We printed out the number 0. We actually updated it at that point, which caused us to print rendering app again. And now notice the value is 1. So what happened there is our first render happened, and that was triggered by this render app. So that's our first render. It sets up the use state. So now count is equal to 0. It sets up this useEffect, but it doesn't run yet. Then we printed rendering app. Then we actually rendered it, which looks like an H1 with a count of 0 in it. Immediately after that, the useEffect takes place. The useEffect printed 0, and then it set the count to 0 plus 1. So it set the count to 1. Now that triggers a re-render. Count is now equal to 1. We print this again. This is returned. So now our H1 will visually look like it has the value 1 in it. But because I gave this an empty list, this doesn't run any again. It only runs that first time. Cool. So let's pause there for questions. And I would say this is a good time, if you're coding along yourself, write a useEffect. Just write a useEffect that does something and does something exactly once after that first render. And you can throw console.logs in there to make sure you understand the order in which that's happening, which is after the render.
Why does the brackets stop from rendering again?
Because, as we see, useEffect takes 2 arguments. One necessary, which is the effect, which is that callback function. The second, this optional thing called deps, which is a dependency list. As we see here, it says that list, if it's present, if it's not present, it runs after every render. If it is present, it only happens if the values in the list change. As it turns out, if there's no values in the list, it only renders once. So we're eventually going to see when we put a value in there, but the default case would be this, where I say, you know, this is going to happen on every single render, console.log count. The problem is that if something causes your page to re-render, this will run again. And so it's easy to end up in an infinite loop if you don't provide it that second argument, which is why you almost always provide it that second argument. And soon we're going to see how you can actually fill in something in that argument. That useful? So Katie, if you put a 1 in there, it would not run one more time. I'll show you how the dependency list works right now. So the dependency list expects like a variable in there. And if the variable changes, it'll trigger the re-render. So let's say I didn't just have an H1 here. Let me open this up and let me put the, you know, something like this in there. Okay. So let's say I also had a button, and this button is going to say, you know, trigger effect. So right now I will have that button, but I didn't hook it up to anything, so nothing happens. Now let's give that button an on click. And as you'll see, useEffect is rarely useful without a use state as well, because useEffect responds to a re-render. Use state is your most basic way of triggering a re-render. So here I have my onClick. What do I want to happen on my onClick? Maybe I'll make it its own function, onClick handler. And I'll define that here. Const onClick handler equals a function, and it'll do something. Okay. So what do I want to happen on click? Well, what I'm going to want to do right now is it's only when this click happens that I want to set some kind of event, right? So I'm going to say something like this. I'm going to say every time I click that button, that's when I'm going to want to add 1 to the count. So I'll take the count, I'll add 1 to it, and then I'll set count to that. So clicking this button will update the count, which will trigger a re-render. So maybe I'll actually change that to be called, like, you know, add 1. Okay. So what does that look like right now? Well, every time I click this, set count will be called. It'll be called with count's current value plus 1. So that's going to be the equivalent of incrementing count. And that'll trigger a re-render. So let's just see that right now. Let me refresh. It starts at 0, and we see rendering app, and then I printed out 0. And we'll remember, rendering app is happening every time there's a re-render, whereas console.log 0 only happens on that first render based on how we wrote it. Coming back here, I'm going to click add 1. What happened? Okay, so we see it now equals 1, and we called it rendering app again. That's because clicking add 1 updated the count. That triggered a re-render. And because our JSX has count in it, it updates. So I can keep doing that. And as you see, you keep seeing re-render. But I actually want to make it so that I'm actually going to print to the console every time I click add 1. So how would I accomplish that? So this list of dependencies, it's going to get triggered anytime a variable in here changes. And you could have more than one. But if I put count in here, what that's going to say is, while the value count is 0, or while the value count, yeah, when the value count is initially going to be 0. And so this is going to run the initial time because count was first non-existent. Now it's 0. Then we're going to render the app. Then we're going to see this. When someone clicks this button, count is going to be updated by 1. That's going to trigger a re-render. On the re-render, this useEffect is going to run so long as count has changed. Because count changed from 0 to 1, we will see this print, but it's not going to be an infinite loop because the set count is only happening in this on click. So the problem before is that we were calling set count within the useEffect, so it's just going to form an infinite loop, whereas this time, set count only happens when we click the button. When we click the button that triggers a re-render, we'll print this out once again, but that's not going to form any kind of infinite loop. So let's see that. I'll save it. Coming back here, refresh. Initially, rendering app, 0. Click add 1. I see 1 here. We rendered the app again. The useEffect ran again. So now we've set up a basic counter that is also aware when the value in its dependency list changes. And so it, you know, the useEffect runs again as a result. Nick, that is not the case to never put set variable inside a useEffect. It's just a matter, it's really more a lesson to almost never have this case. So you don't want to have no dependency list, because no dependency list plus a use state in there will be an infinite loop. Whereas maybe I do want to use some kind of set something in here. I just want to make sure I'm not, whatever I'm setting is not also in the dependency list. So I don't want to create some kind of infinite loop in that way. Yeah. Why does rendering app print before useEffect? Good question, Tristan. So that's just built into how useEffect works. So the first thing that happens when we run this code is that app is rendered. So when app is rendered, we run all this code. And that will include printing console.log. And then after we run that code, we return something. So this is what we're going to see on our screen. And only after that's done does the useEffect trigger, if it triggers at all, but it will trigger the first time. So the useEffect, part of the reason why it's called effect is it happens in response to a cause. That cause is a re-render. So the useEffect always happens after the first render, which is why you always have to have some kind of default value. So like I couldn't, if I didn't have a count here, I couldn't rely on the useEffect to like set the count, because first things first, it's going to render this and it's going to expect something with count. Well, we'll see why that matters a little more once we get into talking to an API. Okay, so before moving on, does this make sense? Lots of allergies.
Bless you.
Thank you. Thank you. Zoom
Does
type.
does yours render twice when you refresh? Can you show that again real quick?
Yeah, let me refresh. No.
Okay. Can you show
Is
your code again? Mine's rendering twice as I was
If yours
following.
is rendering twice, it's likely because of this. So in main.jsx, if you're rendering react.strict mode,
I am.
react.strict mode, part of what it does is render everything twice to help
Okay.
catch weird bugs. So if you take that out, it should stop.
Okay, cool. Thank you.
Cool. Okay, so just to show it, this dependency thing is a list. It's not just one thing. So I could actually have more than one thing in there. So let me make some other thing where I say like, I'm going to call this toggle. And I'll call this set toggle. And I'll start it at false. And then down here, in addition to a button, I'll make an input. And that input will be of type checkbox. So before I do anything else, I do now have a checkbox. Okay, and maybe I'll actually give this a name. So I'll say toggle. And what toggle will do is that on click, I'll maybe say on toggle handler. And I could write these in line, or sorry, not on click, rather on change. I could do these in line, but just to make it clear, I'll do it outside as functions. So on toggle handler will be another function, and it's going to run every time the value of the input changes. Oh, and that's another thing I want to associate them. So the value, or in this case, this attribute called checked, I'll say checked, whether it's checked or not, will be equal to the value of toggle. So toggle is going to be false initially. Seems to be angry about something. Consider input is a void element tag and must neither have children. Oh, I guess, right, that doesn't work. You can't give an input a name.
I'm sorry, I probably missed it, but why are you trying to do the toggle? What's the purpose for it?
Because I just want to show adding another thing to the dependency list.
Okay, got it. Thank you.
Yeah. So I'm just creating this toggle right now, and its value is checked, and I'm not doing anything in the handler yet. So if I come back here, I'll see it's initially empty, and it stays empty no matter how much I click it, because it's being controlled by that checked equal thing. So checked equals false, and it always equals false, so clicking it doesn't make a difference. But now I'm going to set it up so it does make a difference. In this case, I'll call set toggle. And toggle initially equals false, and I'm going to want it to toggle back and forth every time I click it. So I'll do something like this. So toggle, if it's false, will become true. If it's true, it'll become false. And now on toggle handler, just hooked up over here, that'll actually make our checkbox aware. And in addition to saying rendering app, let me actually render these two things that I know about, count and toggle, just to see their values. Let me refresh. Right, rendering app, it's initially 0 and false. And because of that use effect, we saw 0. Now let me click the toggle. Okay. Rendering app 0 true. Untoggle it, rendering app 0 false. So just like any use state, I am going to see these. I'm going to trigger a re-render every time I change it, so it's aware of those changes. But right now that it's the case that we're doing the rest of this printing only when something in that dependency list for the use effect triggered. So let's just review that. So basically what's happening is at first we're creating count and toggle, and there are these two use states. Then I set up this use effect. And let's say I set it up like this. That would mean only on the first render does it ever happen. And let's replace this with something like use effect triggered. And we'll also print out those two values here, which are count and toggle. And then I just have these two helper functions. And then every time I render the app, I'll say, re-rendering app, count, toggle. And then this is the actual body of it. So how does this work? Remember, we just changed this back to an empty list, so this will only run the first time it's rendered. So let's look at it. Okay, our first render, we wrote re-rendering app 0 false, and then we see this 0, we see our button, we see our toggle, and then immediately after that, because that was our first render, we printed use effect triggered 0 false. So now if I do add 1, I re-rendered, the values changed. That'll keep happening. If I toggle, same, I'm re-rendering. But I'm not triggering any more use effects because that dependency list is empty. So as we saw before, I could add count in here. And now if count ever changes, we trigger that use effect. But if toggle changes, it's not going to know to trigger that use effect. Let's see that. Rendered app, use effect triggered the first time because it always will trigger the first time. Now, if I add stuff, both the re-render is happening and then right after the use effect. If I toggle something, the re-render is happening, but the body of that use effect is not happening because it's not aware to care about toggle. But because this is a list, I can add it. So I can say toggle. And then what you'll notice is it's not if both of them change, it's if any of them change. So no matter how many things I have in this list, if any of them's value change, it'll trigger a re-render. Or sorry, it'll trigger another call to use effect. So now add 1, re-renders, causes the use effect, toggle, re-renders, causes the use effect. And in terms of the dependency list being picked up as it changed, it's going to be the same rules as use effect. So if you're using a complex object, you might have to clone it outright in order for it to pick up that it's a new thing. But yeah, if the thing has changed, it'll trigger a re-render. So let's pause here. And I think, this would be another good time for people who are coding along to try this out, because before we do anything useful with use effect, we want to have a little intuition about when it gets triggered, because that's an important part of use effect. All right, questions?
So this just kind of wrapping my head around this, but this example seemed like very simple, kind of on purpose, I'm sure, but it didn't seem like, at least on the page, there wasn't a whole lot of difference in what was being rendered. It's really just what was printed to the console. Is that right?
Absolutely, yeah. So the use effect is not affecting the page right now. I'm just trying to first give us intuition about when it gets triggered, how it gets triggered. And what we're going to build to, the most common use for use effect is to not trigger a console.log, but rather to trigger a backend call.
Okay, cool.
Okay, so people coding along, have you been able to do this? Are you able to get it to respond to, you know, some change to re-trigger your use effect?
Yeah, I was able to replicate what you did.
Okay, good. I think what I'm going to do now is I'll actually, okay, let me see what's next on my list. We saw the demo, we saw this API we're working with, we saw useEffect itself and how it triggers after a render. And then we saw how useEffect and useState work together, where useState will trigger a re-render. And then in response to that re-render, based on what we give the dependency list, useEffect will rerun. And then these are our 3 cases or our 4 cases. One, no second argument at all means every re-render. You almost never want that, but it's an easy mistake to make for beginners because that's the default if you don't give it anything. It happens every re-render, which means it's going to be pretty easy to fall into an infinite loop if you're doing some, you know, re-rendering in response to that useEffect. The default, what it should be, what the default is for most people as they fill it in, is the empty list. That means just do it the first re-render. And that actually is useful because that's all you need sometimes. All you need, you know, if we want to make API requests, maybe we just make an API request right when the, you know, right after the page renders the first time. We get some data, we set state of that data as a result, and then we're done. We never have to make that request again. But there are times where if there's a change, like someone types something in or someone clicks something, you want to trigger that useEffect again in response. And then it's rare, but there are times where there's more than one thing that causes you to want to recall that useEffect. Okay, so now let's actually see calling or using useEffect with an API. So the first thing we'll see is we want to use this library Axios. So Axios is a library that helps us do API requests. There's some built-in things, like there's this built-in thing called fetch, and that lets us do API requests. But in this course, we tend to use Axios, and fetch and Axios are very similar for doing GET requests. But once you do like more complicated requests, Axios has a nice API. So we're going to use Axios, but Axios is a third-party library. So first we're going to have to install it. So I'll say npm install --save Axios. And I'll see here that if I look at package.json, we have Axios now. So let me include it up here. I'll say import Axios from Axios.
How'd you install it? What'd you put?
Down here in my dev console, I did npm install --save Axios. So npm install Axios will install the package Axios. --save makes sure that that's added to this list of dependencies in package.json, which you generally want to do because you generally want other people who, you know, eventually use your project to know, you know, that was a dependency. And when they type npm install with no arguments, it will download that dependency as well. Is that good? All right, gonna assume good. So right, we have access to Axios now.
Yes, sorry. I was muted.
No worries. We have access to Axios now. Now that we have access, I'll just do npm run dev again because I only stopped it in order for us to download a dependency. So back here in app, I'm importing Axios and I can use Axios. So before I do it in a useEffect, let me just see doing it without a useEffect because React doesn't want us to do it that way, but it will work because it is just code. So maybe right up here, I'll say Axios, and Axios has some stuff on it like get. And the first thing for get is a URL. So let me give it a URL, and the URL I'm going to give it is based on that Pokey API. So let me just come back here, come back to Pokey API. Let's just say this. So when I call this URL, if it's successful, I'm going to get back this big object. So let's do that. Let me copy that URL. I'm just going to hard code it to be Squirtle now. And let's see what happens. We're calling get here, right? Okay, let's see what happens. Coming back to my app, refresh. So this is still all happening like normal, 0, add 1, etc. We're not seeing anything with the Pokemon thing. That's because I didn't do anything with it, but it's a network request. So I want to know about just this thing where I looked for Squirtle. There's kind of a lot here, but when you make a request to an API as opposed to making a request that gives you back your HTML or JavaScript stuff, it has a different type. So you see most of these have type script, some have the type SVG. I'm going to click this to say I only want to see my fetches. And if I click one of those, I would see, yep, I made a request to Squirtle. I'm not sure why there's so many, but we don't need to worry about that right now. I made a request to Squirtle. It was a GET request, 200, so it came back successfully. And this was the response. The problem is I'm not doing anything with it right now, right? So coming back here, I might see like, right, I made this request, but I want to do something with it. Well, we'll hopefully have time to get into this more because this is kind of a complex thing that ends up requiring us to dig in sort of deep into how JavaScript really works. But this is part of JavaScript's async. So when we sent this request, we actually didn't stop running the code until it returned. We just kept running the code. And if we didn't do that, until this returned, we wouldn't be able to click on things. We wouldn't be able to interact with the page. And so instead of, waiting on this, instead of having something like const response equals axios.get, and then this would run and it wouldn't end until it actually got the return value and put it in response, and then we'd run the rest of the code. We don't do it like this. We don't say wait for the response and then print the response. We don't do this. Instead, we use this different API. So I'm going to come back here, just see axios.get, and I'll see that if I hover over get, what does it say? So it has this, it's hard to read, but it has this, these inputs that it takes. But look at this, it returns a promise. So what is a promise? A promise is a specific object that lets us work with like async stuff in JavaScript. And the way it works is that this .get will return a promise object. And that promise object gives us some functions. One of them is .then. And .then takes its own callback function called onFulfilled. So it'll look like this. It'll be a function like any other. And in this case, it's going to take an input called, I'll call it response. And then I'll say console.log response. Okay. So let's see this running now. So it just moved it, but there's the .then. The .then will get triggered when that URL comes back with a 200. It'll have a response, and then it'll print that response. Okay, let's see it. Here things are. Okay, we made our Squirtle request. Our Squirtle request returned 200. Let me look at my console. Okay, there we go. I actually printed it, and this is what it looks like. Something config, headers, the status, and then inside something called data, and that's where the actual data I care about is. So coming back here, I might say, I don't just want the response, I want response.data. We'll refresh. Okay, there's my data. So let's say what I wanted to do is I wanted to make this request, and in response, I wanted to print this like sprite, right? I wanted to print I wanted to save this URL so that I could then display it, front default. So maybe I'll try that first. I'll say, okay, I want another use state now. And I'm going to call this use state pokey image and then set pokey image because I like that pattern. And initially it's going to be an empty string. Or even null, but I'll do an empty string. And then down here, I'll say, okay, here's my button, here's my input, but I guess I also have image, right? And that image is going to have a source, and its source is going to be pokey image, which initially is blank. So I haven't done anything with my Axios request yet. I just have that image with a source equal to empty string. So I come back here. Let me refresh. I don't see anything. Interesting to me. I thought I would see like a blank. So it's not going to print it at all, I guess. I thought I would have like an empty, like a broken link thing. But that's okay because yeah, I don't want it to print anything because there is no source yet. And maybe I would even accomplish that explicitly like this, where I would wrap it in these parentheses or these curlies, and I would say like, is image source, or sorry, pokey image. Does pokey image have a length greater than 0? If it does, then print that image, otherwise don't. And the only change that makes is now if I look back here and I refresh, I'll notice that there actually is no image at all. Whereas if I gave that image a value, let's just give it an initial value of high, now it will show it because high.length is greater than 0. And now we'll have an image with source high, and because that's a bad URL, we're probably going to see something like this, where I just see a broken image link looking thing. Okay. Come back here. I'll make that back to empty. Gonna look at the chat. Okay, so all we've done so far is set up this use state thing, right? So we have a pokey image. And what we might want to say now is, okay, so I have this dot then, right? In response to that dot then, I want to do something with it. Well, maybe right there I say, okay, get the Pokemon image. So call this URL Squirtle, and then in response, set the Pokemon image to something. And what do we want to set it to? It's going to look something like this, but we're actually going to want to go in there and see. So if I come back here without saving, I'll see in my console, okay, well, what does response.data have? We have to dig into sprites, and sprites has something called front default. So let's do that. Response.data.sprites.front, what was it? Like that, front default. And I guess before we set anything to it, let's just print that out. So I'm not going to set it yet. Let me comment that out. I'm just going to print it out just to make sure I'm getting the right thing. So how this is going to work now is I rendered app. And part of that was also that I, made that request, and we see that request happening here. And when it returned, I dug into the response and I got this image, which I can then click and see there's an image of Squirtle. Okay. Now coming back here, I might say, right, now that I've done this, I'll get rid of the console.log and I'll actually set the Pokemon image, right? So when I do that, I'll trigger a re-render, and then pokey image will now no longer equal blank, it'll equal the URL. So this should work now. That image or pokey image will have a length greater than 0, and we'll be able to, render this, and we'll actually see the image. So let's see that. Okay, I'm going to refresh. Okay, this works, right? This seems good, but there's an issue. Let's look at the network tag. I'm surprised it's only calling it 3 times. I would assume I would have created an infinite loop. Oh, I guess because it's not changing the value in response. But the way I did it is not really how React wants you to do it, because what's happening here is we render the app, right? Because this is just code, we set off this request. In response, we set the pokey image to something. That triggers a re-render. Then this happens again. This happens again. It triggers a re-render. This happens again. So that's why we want to put our API calls inside of a useEffect, because otherwise, 1 second. Just give me a second. Be right back. Sorry about the interruption. This phone keeps ringing and I can't seem to get it to shut up. Okay. Yeah, you'll never know, right? We'll eventually get to async. Oh, wait, Robert. Okay, so we actually want to wrap this in a use effect. I guess I'll take this use effect out for right now. Or maybe I'll comment this back in. I'll take out this, I guess I can keep use effect triggered. But I'm going to put, it's pokey image I really care about. And I'll say that this only triggers once, right? This is only going to trigger the first time. And this is what I'm going to put in there. So I guess I'll do something like this. Okay, so now I have this use effect. It only triggers once. When it triggers, we do this Axios request. We have a dot then, and that's going to trigger this. Or when there's a response, this is going to trigger, and it's going to set pokey image to something. And to see how this works, maybe the first thing I'll do is say use effect was triggered and the current value of pokey image. And then when it's done, because this doesn't happen in real time, this might happen, you know, way later if there's if you know the network, if the thing you're talking to is far away. So only in here am I going to say, okay, dot then was triggered. And this is what the pokey image looks like after. I wonder actually if this will have the new value or not. Let's see. Okay, so what happens? Well, we made the network request because that use effect happens, you know, after. So we re-rendered, the use effect happened, then the dot then happened, but it looks like I'm not even able to print that pokey image because it's not, it doesn't know about the change yet, because the set pokey image is only updating it on re-render. So maybe I'll just write dot then triggered there, and I'll take these out, but I'll have another console.log that just in general, okay, I say, when I say re-rendering, I'll say pokey image. So now we can see here's the full logic. First, we render the app, then the use effect is triggered. Then at some point, the which, you know, could take a while, the dot then is triggered. That set the pokey image value. Now we re-rendered the app with that image. We see that image, but we're not going into a loop where we keep calling, we keep making requests to Squirtle because we use the dependency list.
Why weren't you able to show the pokey image from within the use effect response?
Yeah, I think the issue there, well, this first time, the way I just had it, I'll put it back, the way I just had it, well, this first time it triggers, it makes sense that it's empty. The question is the second time, why is it empty? That's because set pokey image is going to set this value and trigger a re-render, but that re-render is not going to happen until after this next line is finished running, because it has to finish running the rest of the use effect. And so basically this is going to represent the old value because it's not instantaneous that this happens. It happens once this code is done. So basically it's just not the way we want to do it. And you'll see that
so
fair amount with set that, like,
so,
yeah.
Sorry, what were you saying?
Just that the nature of set is that when you set something, that value is not instantly the new thing. Rather, it sets up a re-render when the current render is done. And so when the current render is done, which includes running code, then it'll set pokey image to the new value, then it will re-render. So the problem is that we're on our first render. On our first render, pokey image is empty, and that includes running this use effect. And running this use effect includes running this axios.get, and running this axios.get eventually runs this dot then. And when the dot then is run, we call set pokey image, and that essentially sets up changing pokey image and re-rendering, but we're not done with the current render yet. This line is left. And so we do that line. When that line is done, because everything else has been done at that point, now we're totally done with this with this first render, then PokeImage is set to its new value, then all of this is run again, and because we did this, this useEffect doesn't happen a second time.
Okay, so essentially line 12 is put in like a queue until you're finished with that render, and then
Exactly.
it does it. Okay.
Yeah, and that's that thing. I mean, we'll maybe get into this a little more today, but this is part of the whole async thing. So like this didn't happen right away. This happened when the response came back. And that the way that works is this thing called an event loop that we'll get to today, hopefully. But essentially, like we're putting something on the back burner to happen when it can happen. But it doesn't happen immediately. And so it's the same thing with React re-rendering. This is setting up something to say, hey, when the current stuff is done, this is the next thing I want you to do, but it doesn't happen instantaneously. Okay, let me get those back to where it was. Okay, so I think I want to give you guys a break right now. So let's take like a 10-minute break. And when we come back, we'll have questions and if anyone has other things, yeah. Cool. So I'll stop sharing for a second. I'm going to resume the recording. I'll start sharing and I'll actually just show it to you because I guess that is kind of useful. Just give me 1 second. Let me get rid of this stuff. So if I come all the way back here and let's say I open this up, I can just show you this for assessments 4. Sorry for dragging everything all the way around. If I go to uniform assessments, assessment 4 aloof Buddhist, that's my version of it. You'll actually see if we open it up, this doesn't have the solution at all, but it does have this dist folder where I've pre-created the solution, and you can see that with package.json. So there's dev, but there's also preview. So if I were to go in here, which is assessment 4, and I was to do npm run dev, that would show you the starting point, which is just this, not much, right? But if you were to do, let's quit out of that, npm run preview, that'll show you the ending point without actually giving you the code for it. So if I click that, this is what we want you to build. And we will go over this more Friday, but what we're essentially asking you to build is first this up here where it's going to say home, my team, you know, and the number of Pokemon, search to search a specific Pokemon, and a search button. You're going to have a list of these Pokemon, which you will be using Poke API to get. When I click on one, we'll see a separate page. We get to that tomorrow. It shows Blastoise and it shows some information about him, and I can catch him. Maybe I go back home and I also catch Pidgey. And then I look at it and I see that I have Blastoise and Pidgey. And then for search, I can search any Pokemon, which is not hard to do. It's just how the API works. So not just those 30, but what's a Pokemon that's not in the first first game for our Pokeheads? What's a Pokemon you like?
Delibird.
What was it? Diddlybird, Grunkle, Snorlax?
Delibird.
Delibird. I'm gonna go
That's in the first game or not?
Cyndaquil.
I guess it can be in
Cyndaquil's
the first
in the
game.
second game.
I just wanted to show you something that's not in that first list of 30. So in that list of 30, we don't have Snorlax. But if I look for Snorlax, there he is. I catch him. I look at my team. Okay, my team has Snorlax on it. And this is the basic app we're asking you to make. And it even works with, you know, if I do a big number. Oh, well, actually, no, it breaks because that's not a real one. But we want you to be able to do that error handling too. But if I do 444, there is Gabite, our favorite Pokemon. 541, everyone's favorite Pokemon, Swadloon. Now Swadloon is on the team. It's a pretty fun app. So this is what we're going to be asking you to build, and it's going to utilize everything from this week. And what we get to tomorrow that you're going to see is how you actually have these separate pages. So home is a page, team is a page, and we all remember Mew's number. Pokemon /151 is a page. Great. There's my great team. But we're gonna talk about that more Friday. I agree with you, Chris. I only ever played. Oh, you say the first 2 gens. I only played the first one. I played it on a Pokemon Color, but the original Pokemon Red and Blue, they weren't even in color, so it just made the whole thing one color. If you were on a Game Boy Color. So that was my life. One time I was making a trade with someone back when you had a wire to trade it, and some other kid in school, like an older kid, came up and he chopped the wire in the middle of a trade, and I got so angry I punched him. So, you know, we all have a temper. Yeah, I know, I got real angry, but don't do that. Don't you know, why did he do that? He didn't do that for a good reason. That is my origin story. All right. Okay, coming back. So we've discussed useEffect and the Axio stuff. We haven't gotten too much into the promises yet. But before moving on, we really want to dig into this because I think this approach is good where we build up little by little. And you know what, at this point, I'm going to take these counts out because I just want to understand. I'm going to take the toggle and the count out because I just want to see now this very basic app, which I'm going to call, like, you know, Pokey Viewer. And this is all that Pokey Viewer does right now. And what it does, it's obviously going to render this the first time. And it's going to render this if there's a Pokey image with length greater than 0. And starting out, that'll be blank. But then we have our useEffect, which, because of the dependency list, only runs once after the first render. We're printing that it triggered here, and then we trigger this get, and that get itself might take time to respond. So if we were really far away or on a really slow server or really slow connection, we would see that. And then when it comes back, we set the Pokey image to that data. We print out that the dot then was triggered. Suppose I could do that before. And then once it re-renders, we'll now see it. And that does work as expected. And actually another cool thing to see when you're working with Chrome DevTools is I can go to network here. There's a bunch of things here. So like disable cache is a common one, and that'll just make it so that it's never going to give you, like, if you made a call to something, it won't just give you whatever it stored recently. It'll make the call again. And you often want that because it helps you to fix errors. But look at this. There's actually this thing here in network called no throttling. That's the default. But I could say, oh, what if I'm on a fast 3G connection or slow 3G connection or totally offline? And that way we can kind of see that, like, okay, now I'm going to reload. It kind of takes a while. And this is what, you know, someone who's in like rural India, they don't have a great, I mean, they're probably even slow 3G. This is what actually happens. And you see it takes a little time for things to populate. And that can kind of help you think about how your app works. So let's see, slow 3G, it's going to take even longer. It's going to take so long we don't want to think about it, maybe. But okay, let's leave it at fast 3G. And any questions about how this is working right now? So I'll look at the chat. There's nothing in the chat. Does this make sense to people? This process by which we render the app, the useEffect happens after the first render, and then in response, something is going to happen.
I had a question on, so in your, do you need that Pokey image dot length, like, or could you just have image source equals Pokey image?
Yeah, so we could. As it turns out, it's not totally necessary because it looks like HTML by default, if you give it a source equal to empty string, it doesn't show anything. So you're right that technically it doesn't need to be there. We're still on the slow 3G thing, which I'm going to leave on, or sorry, the fast 3G thing, which I'm going to show for now. But yeah, so you might have noticed for a second there, we didn't see anything, right? So we didn't see like a broken image. Whereas if I come back here and I say like, okay, the starting image is not, you know, what it eventually be, but it's just like nonsense. Now it will show something. It'll just show something broken. So I believe it will. Like if I look at elements, I should have a. So yeah, there we go. Now we have React working. Okay, it happened so fast, maybe you couldn't see it, but I'm not sure actually. It looks like it doesn't matter. It doesn't have to be there. That was basically just saying, what if it's not here? But something you will often see is like, so our page relies on this pokey image, right? And so if we reload, first the page has to load. And because I'm doing this like fast 3G connection, that actually takes a second. But once the page loads, we just see that, and then the image pops into place. So that's not the ideal user experience. What you might want is something more like this, where this is a really common pattern. I'll have another use state, and here I'll say loading and set loading, and loading will initially be false. So I'm not loading initially. Or maybe actually loading is initial. No, yeah, I'm not. I'll say initially I am loading because I know that's the first thing I'm going to do. So then I would do something like this where I might say, you know, wrap these in the curlies, and then I'll say, am I loading? If I am loading, I'll want to show something like, let's say pre, and it'll just say loading ... If I'm not loading, that means we successfully got the thing. So now we'll see that I said loading is true, and that's always true. So if I reload this, it takes a second to even get the whole thing. But once it's there, we just see loading, even though eventually, you know, this happened. So what I actually want to do, the common pattern is I'll say something like this. Okay, loading is going to start out as true. Maybe I'll do that by default, but when this use effect happens, that means I'm about to make this request, right? So the use effect is going to happen after the first render. And the first thing I want to do is say set loading to true. So if loading wasn't yet true, I set it to true. And then it's going to log this, and then it's going to set off this request, and then it's done. This request is eventually going to come back, and when it comes back, that's when I want to say set loading to false, because it's only if loading is false that I actually show the image. So now that's going to be a bit better behavior, where I'm going to refresh. I'll see Pokey Viewer eventually. I'll see loading, and then when it's done loading, we actually see the image. So that's our ideal user experience, and we're going to leave that in there because we're going to use this more. And that's part of the whole thing where, by the nature of useEffect, it only happens after the first render. So you want to make sure that your initial render has some state that makes sense. So by using loading, I have a situation where I say, because I know there's no Pokey image yet, I don't just want to show blank. I want to actually show something that implies, hey, we're loading an image right now. And if it was fancier, it would be like a spinner or something. And then eventually when that's done, I'm showing the other thing. I'm showing the image because that Pokey image is there. Okay. So before moving on, any questions? Because we really can dig in at this point and we want to.
You go back to your code just for a second.
Yes.
You scroll down to your return. Thank you.
Yes, we're doing the turn everything where we're saying if this was true, this, if it was false, this. Okay, so the next thing we want to see is a little bit more about promises. So promises have a certain API. When I say API, I'm not talking about a RESTful API. I'm not talking about talking to a backend. I'm just saying, you know, a promise supports certain functions, and that's how we work with it. So we've already seen that .get returns a promise. And then the way we work with it, at least so far, is this. We have this .then, which, you know, this actually returns an object. So .then is on the object. Might look a little funny, but you get used to it. Well, there's other things that we could have on it. One of them is .catch. .catch won't take response. It'll take something like error, which I'm just giving it a different name. And then inside there, I'll say console.error, and then the name of that error. So console.error will just print to the console in red. And what it'll take is whatever this value of error was. And to see that work, to see why we do it this way, this is going to trigger the .then, because when this is called, eventually it gets a 200 response. So coming back here, I'm going to, let's put it back to just no throttling. Okay, so we got a 200, and because we got a 200, the .then body happened, .then triggered. And that kicked off all of this. But not everything we call like this is going to get a 200. So there could be a situation where you get like a 500, which means that like the actual server you're talking to has an issue. But if I just take this link here, if I didn't do Squirtle, but I did a Pokemon that doesn't exist, like Pikachu, because Pikachu is hard to spell, what happens? So I'm going to click enter. I'm going to wait. Not found. Okay. And if so this not found, I'm going to guess this is not returning a 200 error, success code, but some kind of 400 error code. So let's try that. I'm going to try and request Pikachu, and we'll see what happens. I'm going to put in here console.log.catch triggered. Okay, so coming back here, we're going to look at our app or reload. So what happened? So we rendered the app, the useEffect was triggered because it's the first time. We actually got a 404 here, and that automatically prints to the console. And then it doesn't ever do the .then because it wasn't successful, because it didn't get a response with good data. It knew not to try and run that and give a bad, some bad data to Pokey URL. Instead, the .catch triggered. What my .catch does is it just prints this object that Axios gives to us. And in this case, we might care about just the message. So what I might have there is something like this, where, I'm making this even more sophisticated, where I might say like, oh, I don't just have loading and set loading. Maybe I also have something like, error message and set error message, and the use state is initially empty. And I'll set something up initially where I'll say like, okay, well, if it is loading, I want you to show loading. If it's not loading, I can do it like this, where I could say like, I'm sure the auto format is going to like redo this for me probably, but I'm saying if it's loading, show loading. But let's say it's not loading, but error message has a length greater than 0. And I can just actually write that like this. I can just say if there's an error message, because if it's the empty string, that'll count as false. So if there is an error message, then actually show the error message. And then only if it's neither of those cases do I want to show the image. Okay, it cleaned it up a little for me. And so what do we have now? Well, what I have now is that I'm coming back here. I'm going to reload. We rendered app. The useEffect was triggered. Oh, we got a .catch, but we didn't actually set anything, so it's still showing loading. So what I might want to do here then is to say, okay, if we got that error, I'm going to print all this, but error actually had something in it. Let me look again what it was. Error.message. Okay, so then I'm going to say set error message to error.message. And because of how I set this up, I said only if it's, if it's loading, that's the first thing I check, show loading. If it's not loading, but there is an error message, show that. If it's neither, show the image. So I'm actually not only going to want to set the error message here, I'm also going to want to say set loading false. And that actually makes sense because whether it was successful or not, we want to call set loading false as long as the, response, as long as we got a response, whether it was a successful or an unsuccessful response. So let's see that in action.
You had a typo in your set error message.
Where?
Line
Let's see.
34.
Yeah, there you go. Yeah. So
Oh,
error
okay.
message was still blank. So that's it. Let's try that again. Oh, I still have I have an even worse typo.
Yeah, it was like line 34.
Line 34. Okay. Good catch. Well, I didn't call it error
35.
message.
No, 35. Sorry.
Arrow.
Error message. Yeah. Okay, let's try that one more time. Cool. It happens pretty quickly. So maybe we want to do a little throttling. Seems like with the throttling, most of the time it takes is just to, I guess, I think that makes sense. The only thing we have control of is throttling our website, not throttling PokeImage. So yeah, we tried to go with Pikachu. We got back a 404. We set the error message, and then we also set not loading, so we do see it. I'll put this back. And if I really wanted to do this, nicely, maybe I would add a class to it. So this would have like, class name equals error. And then in my index.css, I would add a class like error, and it would just have color red. And now if we saw that, it would be red. Yeah. So this is a better experience. And coming back here, maybe I'll take this back to Pikachu. Let's try that again. There's Pikachu. Great. So I handle my two cases with my dot then and then my dot catch. But actually, there's one thing I can do to make this a little nicer. So you see I'm set loading false regardless of what happens. Well, there's actually something it gives you in addition to dot then and dot catch, which is called dot finally. Dot finally will trigger on either one. It doesn't need to take anything as the argument because it's just a callback. And that's where I might want to set loading to false. So now, regardless of which branch we ended up down, we're going to set loading to false. Now I'll see that. In that case, it works and we set loading to false. And if we change this to, take the K out, it still sets loading to false. Okay. So how are we feeling about this? My biggest concern is that we really want to dig into how promises work. But you guys can tell me, is this helpful enough? Because a lot of the lecture content I prepared for this is digging into exactly how async works in JavaScript, but that might be more than you need.
So is that dot catch, is that mostly just for errors, or are there any other uses for that?
Dot catch will only trigger if it's not a 200. Yeah.
Okay. And then I guess if you would have had like set loading to true within
Hey, Sophia, shut the door.
Sophia should shut the door. Very true. Sorry, what was that?
Sorry about that.
What I was saying now. If you had anything else, I get like set loading to true in there, would that return the error and then still continue to say loading? Not that you would want to do that, but I'm just like curious what's going on in dot catch.
The dot catch, say that one more time.
So like if you had set loading to true within, I guess you don't have it in dot catch anymore.
Yeah, so the idea is that dot then is only triggered on it. So basically what happens is this. The use effect is triggered because it's after the first render. The first thing we do is set loading to true. And then we also print this. Then axios.get, this runs in real time. That triggers the get request. but it doesn't necessarily return immediately because, you know, we want the website to keep running in between. And so the dot then is set up on this object to say when we get a response, if it's a 200, if it's a good response, then we do this. If it's a bad response of some kind, we do this. Regardless of whether it was a good or bad response, always do this at the end.
Okay, that makes sense. Thank you.
Yeah. And dot finally is the least necessary of them because you could have just repeated that logic in both. But it's still nice to know about.
You show the top for your use state default setting for the error messages. Okay, so you just left that as an empty string there. Is there a
Yeah.
reason why that was left as an empty string?
Yeah, because we want it to initially be an empty string. Because when this first loads, loading is going to be true, so this will happen. But I want the error message to be nothing. Because let's say loading is now, basically what else could be the default for an error message? And we shouldn't assume an error message should start. And in fact, let's try and update this now. Let's do this together. I don't want this to merely be a PokeViewer that always looks for Pikachu. Let's integrate this with an input, right? So I'm going to create an input and I'm going to have all of you do the rest. So this input, what's its type?
On submit.
Text.
Text.
Oh, yeah.
So on submit would be like a callback, but we don't have to do it that way. So I'm just going to say on submit text. And what do we want to do? We want to do something in response to the text changer? What, or I guess what I'm asking is what's the function that lets us respond to change?
We're gonna want to call set Pokemon name once we constitute that, right?
Exactly. Yeah. So I'm going to just call on change and I'll say on input change. And what do we'll have to set that up now. So I'll just write that maybe down here. We don't need these as much anymore. I'll take out some of these console.logs because they're probably only confused or, you know, littering our code. So I'm going to make this on input change. And I probably wanted to update some state in response, but that state doesn't exist yet. So how am I going to want to, what am I going to want to do to update that state? Like what state do we want to keep track of?
Pokemon name.
Yeah, and we're going to want that to be a use state. So we'll do poke name. And then what might I call this second argument?
Set poke name.
Yep, that's what I like. And then what might be a good initial value for the poke name?
None.
Yeah, I like that. Yeah. So just empty string. Great. And then I want to make sure that this input is always showing that value. So the on change will react, but what should the value be for the input?
Poke name.
Exactly. So we're tying the input to poke name, and then we make sure that our on change does something with poke name. So what should my on input change function look like? First off, does it take some kind of input?
Event.
Yep, event. And then what do I want to do inside of on input change?
Can't our on change just include the set Poke name?
Yeah, I mean, it will, right? I mean, you just answered my question. That's what we wanted to do. We wanted to utilize set poke name.
Why do we have to put it in the on input change? Sorry, I'm like,
oh, you're saying as opposed to put it just in line?
Yeah.
You could put it in line. You could put everything in line. I just thought it would make it a little simpler to look at.
Okay, kind of like just like a handler.
Exactly.
There.
In reality, I probably would also do it on one line because it's going to be so short, but I just thought let's break it up.
Okay.
So what do we want to do in the body of on input change?
Return set Poke name, parentheses, Poke name.
Close. Well, first, we're not going to be returning anything because the on change is it doesn't return anything. It just it does something, but the change will be triggered by set pokey name. But now, what do we want to set pokey name to?
Event target.
What's up?
I said event target.
Yeah, event dot target dot value. That's going to be the pokey name. Yeah, that's going to be the name of the current thing. And just to see that working, let's say that every time we render, let's print out pokey name to see it. We're basically ignoring this bit right now, even though it will be happening. Okay, coming back here, looking at my console. Okay, so I'm going to start typing A, B, C, D. So it is responding to it, but I kind of want to be careful that if I start typing Pikachu, every time I type, this is going to update, but not every time I type is that a valid Pokemon name. So if we could make it like the way like Google search works now is that every time you type a character, it sends off a new search. We don't want that. We want to make it that you type something and then only when you click search is it actually going to happen. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to come back here and I'm actually going to change this from, actually, you know what, we can leave it as Pokename. But I'm going to make another use state called Poke search value and then set Poke search value. And that's also going to start as empty, but I want to make it so only when we click the button do we set the current value back. So I'm going to have a button here. And this button is going to say search and it's going to have an on click, and that on click is going to be you know, I'll call it on search click. And we'll define that over here. Const on search click. And we don't care about the event. Okay. So now what do I want to do when I click on search? And just to see, I'll put this in here. So for right now, this is all on search does. So coming back here, I'm going to refresh. As I type, nothing happens because I'm not printing every time. But if I click search, now I actually see it because that value is being updated as we go. So now that I have this value, what do I want to do when I click search?
I want to change the dependency array.
Eventually, yeah. But the first thing I want to do is I actually want to set the Poke search value because that's what we're going to do the dependency based on. So Poke search value currently equals empty, but I want to set it to what?
Poke name.
Exactly. So all we're going to do in here is set Poke search value, Poke name. And that will work if I were to print, like, let's say down here, I'll print console.log Poke search value. So that's going to initially be empty. And then I'm going to start typing and it's still empty each time because of where I wrote it. It's going to print each time. Now, when I click search, it equals this. But you'll notice this still has this whole value in there. We probably want to blank that out. So if I want to blank this out when I click search, what do I do? So I set Poke search value to Poke name. What else do I want to do?
Do you do event.target.value equals an empty string?
Well, we don't need to worry about event.target.value anymore because remember, we made it so the input always reflects the Poke name. So whatever Poke name is, that if that changes, the value input shows will also change.
So would you use set Poke name to empty string again?
Exactly. Just set Poke name back to the empty string. And now we have something even better. We start typing. I click search. It blanks it out, but we see that update. And at this point, now that we know it's working, we can take out this console.log. So now we're making it so that only when you click search does search value have a real value. So that now is a good candidate. We're not using it anywhere else. That's a good candidate for this, for the dependency list. We're saying, don't just run this the first time, actually run it whenever search value changes. Okay, so now anytime search value changes, it's going to run this, but something to keep note of is it'll still run it the first time because Pokey search value first didn't exist. Now it has a value of empty string. So that means if within here I tried to do like, what am I going to get? Well, I'm not going to get, specifically Pikachu. I'm going to get Pokey search value. Well, the first time I search this, it's actually going to return whatever this returns, right? With an empty string. So let's just see that. So this will trigger every time this value changes. Coming back here, I'm going to refresh. Okay, the first time it got confused. Why did it get confused? Because wow, remix. Whoever that was, we got some echo. Does that person want to talk, or they can't right now because of the echo? Yeah, Kelvin's rocking out. Yeah, well, anyways, the thing is we made this request /Pokemon. Sorry, we can see that here. We made this request to /Pokemon because initially Pokey search value was empty. And because that didn't have something correct, we got an error. That's actually something worth seeing, that our error actually happened because it couldn't read something from undefined. So if I come back here, it actually got something back. It's just that when it tried to parse what it got back, it didn't have this thing. This was undefined, or sprites was undefined, so then this broke. And if something breaks at any point in your dot, then you jump to your dot catch. So we still saw an error, which was a good situation. And if we jump back here, we'll see that actually if I do Pikachu now, did I not write Pikachu right? Is that Pikachu? Let me see what's going on here.
It should be giving you a 404 if it's not right. Right?
Yeah, no, and you're right. I'm getting a 200. And so why isn't that working? Because that does have... Oh, I know why. Yeah, because check it out. When we do this, we set the error message as something. And by the nature of this error message, if it has anything, it's going to show it regardless of whether there's an image there. So actually, this is the sort of stuff you have to learn to take care of over time. Not only when we trigger one of these use effects again, do we want to set loading to true, we actually want to set error message back to empty, because if there was an error before, it shouldn't affect this time. So let's try that again. I'm going to refresh. Initially, we have the error. We'll take care of that. If I do Pikachu now it works. Great. And now the last thing to do here is to say, okay, that first time it runs, Pokey search is an empty string. I don't actually want to run this in that case. So I'm just going to set a basic guard where I say, I'll wrap this whole thing in an if, or even I don't have to wrap the whole thing in an if. Instead, I could say something like this. If Pokey search value, if Pokey search value, if its dot length is 0, or if it is the empty string, however you want to put it, if Pokey search value is 0, just return early. Don't do anything. And if it's not, then do the rest of it. Now we're going to get the behavior we want, where initially we just see loading. Oh, I don't like that either. So it's almost like this. I want to say like, because I set loading to true initially, maybe I'll say like, if it's the first time we're doing this, just set loading to false and then return early. Otherwise, or maybe even that, maybe honestly, it should start out as false. And it's only if you click it that you set it to true. So now I think this works like expected, right? We have nothing. If I type Pikachu and I search, we saw loading for a second, then I saw it. If I do Squirtle, it does it as well correctly. If I do Squirt, that ain't no Pokemon. loading. Eventually it fails, great. If I now do something that is in there, it'll work, great. And then if I just do blank, nothing happens, which is the behavior we want. Cool, so we're building up some useful stuff, and this is how I would generally do it. Like you kind of build things up step by step. Okay, so we've made some good progress. One more thing we want to see maybe is coming back here. Let me print out response.data before I do anything. Console.log response.data. Okay, I'm gonna refresh console. So now I'm gonna type Squirtle search. Okay, we got all of this. So think about this. What if you wanted to first get Squirtle, but then once you got Squirtle, that wasn't enough. You actually wanted to, what's something else you might want to, basically what I want to show is, let's say you wanted to make a request, but then based on that request, you wanted to make another request, because that's a pretty common situation where I might say, okay, I want to get Squirtle. Okay, maybe this. Squirtle has an ID of 7. And I believe what that means is that if I were to say 7, that's going to represent Squirtle, yeah. And if I were to say 8, that's going to represent Wartortle. Okay, so what if I wanted to do something like this? I wanted to say, this is Squirtle, but then right next to it, I want to say, who's the next Pokemon, who's the next Pokemon after Squirtle? So the way I'm going to do that is I'm going to utilize that ID. And I'm going to do that like this. I'm going to say, okay, here's my response. Well, console.log response.data, it also has this ID in it, right? This was Squirtle's ID. Let me just see it to make sure. Okay, Charmander, search. There's Charmander. He's number 4. I want to use that data to make another request. So what I'm going to want to do is use that response.data.id. I don't have to print it anymore. Instead, I'm going to say something like in here, well, I want to do another one of these gets. I'll say axios.get. And what I want to get is very similar. But this is based on, I want to base this on what I just did. So when I search for Squirtle or whoever, I got something with an ID. Now I want to say, actually do something like response.id, like .data.id, and this is going to be the next one, right? And this is a way I could do it, and I'm going to say axios.get response.data.id, and then .then, and then I could have all this stuff in there, on a response, do this, and what do I do on a response? Maybe I do something very similar. I'll say, set. I'll make this in a second, set next Poke image, and it'll be the exact same thing. And we'll just create one like that. So here's Poke image. Here's next Poke image. This is set next Poke image, also starting as blank. And we'll just show it right after. So here we show, maybe I'll say like H3, this Pokemon. Oh, it wants me to wrap them, right? And then right under that, I'll say next Pokemon, and its source will be next Poke image. Okay, so let's see that working. This Pokemon, next Pokemon, right? So first I'll say Squirtle. Not quite right? Because I did the ID. So I actually wanted to say like ID +1. Let's try that again. Okay, we saw it right. So if I say Charmander, that's Charmander, that's the next one. And you actually might have noticed this loaded and then this loaded in a second later because it was a separate request, and we could see that. Here's a request. Here's another request. So the way that I did it so far, yeah. So you'll say I nested API calls, like Kelvin is saying. That works, but it gets kind of ugly really fast. And part of the problem with that is that, well, what if this second one had an error? Like, let's say I was literally looking at the last Pokemon. If I did ID +1, that would not respond well. That would result in an error. And then I'd have to write another, I'd have to, copy all this dot catch. I'll have to copy this dot finally stuff. Actually, I won't. The dot finally will happen anyways. But promises have a solution for this. They don't want you to do it this way. Here's what they want you to do. We had this first dot then, right? But instead of doing it like this, I'm actually going to do this. I'm going to say return. So after I do that first one, I'll say return. Return axios.get, that whole thing. And then I'm going to take this out, the dot then. Okay, so after I get that first response, I set the Poke image, and then I use it to create another request, but I return it. Why do I return it? Because now instead of nesting it, we have this pattern in which I'm going to say, okay, if there was a response, like if this first dot then triggered another request, well, then we handle it in the second dot then. And that one is going to do the same thing as it turns out, but it's working with next Poke image. And the cool thing about this is now, if the first one has an error, this dot catch will trigger. If the second one has an error, the dot catch will also trigger. If the first one has an error, the second dot then never happens. It immediately jumps to the error. And so this way we don't have to write, like it ends up being flatter, and we like that. So we don't want to nest. So now this works again like expected. I have nothing initially. I do Squirtle. There we go. I could do 555. Is that a Pokemon? Yep, that's this guy. And this is the next one apparently. And so that's pretty cool. We're able to do things in sequence like that. That is everything, I think. The dot then, which returns something followed by another dot then, it's a relatively advanced pattern. You don't end up having to use it even for the assessment. But it is worth knowing about, because in real world situations, you often do have that where you make some request for like a user's data. Not everything's going to be contained in that one request, but you're going to get something back like the user's ID, and you could use that to request something else. And so this is the way that you would make a request and then make another request in response. Yeah, so let's stop here for a minute.
What happens if you get to a Pokemon that doesn't have a next Pokemon? Will the catch method hit and then not fulfill the first then?
Yeah, so that's what's great about this. So can anyone find out what's actually the highest number Pokemon? Because I want to actually see this. I go 888. Is that a Pokemon? It is. Go 955. Oh, and I love that. Okay. There are so many Pokemon. Does anyone know how many Pokemon there are total? Okay, it's somewhere between those. But this isn't going to go well just guessing. Anyone what is the highest Pokemon?
I think 1010. That's what Google says at least.
1281.
What was that? Someone said?
1281 apparently.
1281. Didn't I just try 1200?
Yeah, you just did 1200 in it.
Google said 1010.
Okay, let's try that. So if I do 1010.
I think you had 100.
You
What?
did 1100.
1010.
What?
No, not 100. 1010. Sorry.
1010. Got it. Okay.
Yes.
But I imagine this will not
never
work.
mind.
No, that I think so. The question is, does this work? 1009. Great. So 1009, we got a Pokemon and we got their next Pokemon. What happens when we do 1010? Let's look at it in the network tab. So let's clear this out. Search. So that first one was successful. Then we added one to it. That one was unsuccessful. So that's the real power of, not nesting. but using this, return thing, because this first one was successful. So this actually ran. We set that first pokey image. Then this second one, it ran. It was unsuccessful. So this dot then didn't happen. It jumped to the same dot catch. It registered an error message. And because of that, if we go down here, we actually see, the error message itself. And maybe we would want to, mess with this a little, where maybe we would want to say like, actually, it's only if it's not done loading, we show loading. If it is done loading, then we always show, this. But maybe each one of these things, we would say something like, if there is an error message. No, that doesn't really make sense. I would have to have two separate error messages. Maybe just over here, I would say something like, I'll just put my error message down here. I'll say like, if there is an error message, then show the error message. So I don't know that in terms of getting the right user experience, that can be a little difficult. But if I were to say like 1010 now, it got that first one, couldn't get the second one, and then it did show an error. So a lot of that would be getting very specific about the UI. Yeah, I'm learning a lot about I learned a lot about Pokemon in doing this, but I love this Poke API. And you'll see more of it. But yeah, this is cool because it lets you make a request, make another request in response, but no matter where the error happens, and you can imagine on something really complex, you might make a request, which makes a request, which makes a request. No matter where the error happens, it's essentially going to bubble up. You're going to jump right to that dot catch in response. Okay, so that's basically everything I wanted to cover. If I come back here, I'll see, oh, right, the last thing, async await. We do want to talk about that. But I just do want to say, if we look at, I guess where is it? I guess I closed the curriculum entirely. Yeah, if I open up the curriculum doc for today, sorry, yeah. So you'll see there's a fair amount of stuff in here, including all of this, sync versus async, async in vanilla.js, callbacks, promises. So it turns out if you really want to understand, how these promises work, there's a fair amount to know, because JavaScript, unlike Python, unlike most languages, is not synchronous by default, meaning it doesn't wait for every command. It doesn't wait until that command is done running before it continues the program. JavaScript works in this way, which it needs to for the sake of the internet, where you do something like make a request. The request happens immediately, but we don't wait for it to return. Instead, we immediately continue running the program, which is a website. And then only when the response happens is some kind of callback function, which is what promises are based on, do something in response. If we didn't do it this way, it would take the same amount of time to return, but in between, you'd be waiting. Nothing would be responsive. And so this is necessary for the fact that you want to keep working with a website, even if some data you're waiting on has not arrived yet. So we actually build this up a fair amount, and there's this website JSV 9000, which can be useful for seeing this process of like what happens when. And maybe that is worth just looking at. So if I look here, let me come back to my example back here. I have some code over here, and I'm going to copy paste it in. And this is some code I wrote, and you can read the comments, but it's just to give you a sense of like how JavaScript actually does things asynchronously. And to do that, I'm not making a request, but I'm using this built-in function called set timeout, which basically mocks a request because it doesn't happen right away. It happens 2,000 seconds later, or even 0 seconds later. And we'll see what that, or sorry, 2,000 milliseconds later. But we'll see with the 0 case, it actually still does something you might not expect. So let's run this and go through it one step at a time. Okay, so we have the step button here, step. So the first thing we're going to do is just read these functions. Or actually, maybe that's actually running it at this point. So just like any normal function, the first thing we do is actually read these functions and register them, but they're not called yet. Then the first thing I do in my code is call say my name A. And this is a standard function call. It's synchronous. So what happens is it was added to the call stack. So the call stack is where synchronous stuff happens. And then it immediately happened. We printed something in the console. So now let me step again. What's the next thing that happened? The next thing that happened is we're calling set timeout. Set timeout takes a callback called say my name B, and it's going to register it to happen in 2 seconds. So step, okay, it didn't get added to the call stack. Instead, it got added to the task queue. The task queue, also called the event loop or event queue, is this thing that JavaScript has, which is for background stuff. It's saying, I registered this to happen. It hasn't happened yet. And that's going to be just like a request. A request will happen right away, but the .then, that's not going to happen until some event that triggers it. So in this case, the event is 2,000 milliseconds pass. With a request, the event is I got a response. And, you know, timeout, I never got a response. It's also a kind of response. So I'll continue. Immediately we continue our program. Say my name C, that's synchronous. So it just happens right away. It's added to the call stack and then immediately executed. We continue on. Say my name D. So that's set timeout set up say my name D for 0 milliseconds. Notice it doesn't happen right away. Even though I said it happens in 0 milliseconds, the first thing that happens is it's added to this queue because all synchronous code runs before any asynchronous code. I step again. There's say my name E. That prints right away. Now, once all the synchronous code is done running, see, we hit this, it says re-render because that would matter for UI, but because this is just some node type code I'm running, there is no UI. But the point is, now this is kind of why React does it the way it does it with useEffect. Once the render is done, now all the asynchronous stuff can happen. So what happens now, because we're done running synchronous stuff, we start looking at that task queue. And the way the task queue works is there's going to be some trigger. So in this case, even though this was added to the task queue first, it's whatever, in the case of the timer, it's whatever expires first. So in the case of like requests, it's whatever was returned first, because you might make a request A and then make another request B after, but it could be that B, it gets its response first. So you can't guarantee the order requests return in. In this case, with the set timeout, we're just arbitrarily saying that the thing we called second is going to expire first. So now the next thing that happens is it's going to get the first thing it can that's expired off the task queue. That's say my name D. So that now happens. And then the next thing is say my name B is ready. And that happens. So I'm going to look at the chat right now. I hope that didn't super confuse people. It's a lot. People don't generally like to think about the async stuff in JavaScript because it's so confusing to think about. But that's why promises exist, because promises are our way of not having to think about this logic and how it's out of order, essentially. Okay, so that was that. I'll close that. But coming back here, the last thing I want to show is that if I look at my plan, one thing my plan said number 9 for my plan was async await syntax. So there's actually modern syntax that in JavaScript that works with promises so that we can make it look a little more like synchronous code. So if I come back here, I'll see, you know, my dot thens are just happening here. This might be somewhat hard to read, and it's because it's a single object being returned by the dot get, and then we have a dot then on that, we have a dot then on that. So that object chaining syntax can be a little difficult to read, and that's why async await exists. But async await is purely what we would call syntax sugar. It's not giving you a new ability the language didn't already have. It's just making your syntax a little nicer. So let's see how we do async await. The first thing to note is that useEffect. So async await is basically this. I'll just write it out here first. You could have a function, and I'm going to call my function hello, and it takes some values, maybe x, and I guess it does console.log x. That's a normal function. What I can add to it is this keyword async. If I do that, what that's saying is that console.log, or it's not expecting hello to return, you know, to just do something. It's actually going to expect it to return some kind of promise. So now it kind of expects that I do something like return axios.get. But the cool thing about async is that once I use this keyword async, that means in the body, I could actually use this other keyword await. So instead of doing it like this, I'm going to say await axios.get. And then that lets me write something like this. So instead of doing the dot then callback, it's ultimately still promises under the hood, but it looks like it's waiting when I call this. And when it gets a response, it's going to store it in a variable, and then I can do whatever I want with that variable. Okay, so async is a function, and it's a function that returns a promise, or that works with promises. And the way you work with the promises is using this sister keyword called await. So let's now refactor everything in useEffect to do that. So I'm going to get rid of this. But the first thing to note is that you might want to do this. You might want to say, oh, well, the top level thing to async to useEffect, that's an async function. React will not like this. You could try it out. You're going to get an error message. Let me just try that just by adding async there. If I reload, React gives us a very specific error message saying it doesn't like what you did because useEffect can't return blah, blah, blah. It doesn't like it, right? It knows exactly what I did and it doesn't like it. And it even recommends the solution, which is inside of the useEffect, define an async function and then just immediately call it. So that's what we're going to do. What I'm going to do is take all of this logic. It's going to disappear for 1 second. I'll copy it. And what I'm going to do is actually say async function, and we'll call this function inside like, you know, search. Just going to call it search. And then in the body of the function, we're going to do something, and then I call it down here. So that's the basic pattern in order to use async await. And now I'm going to put all this code in here, but I'm ultimately going to refactor it. So when this useEffect runs, it's first going to see this function. It's going to register it, and then it's going to immediately call it. But what do I do inside of here? Well, I could still do this where I say like if pokey search value dot length, okay, immediately return. But what I'm going to do here is a little different, where I'm going to say, okay, set loading to true, set error message. Instead of doing axios.get, etc., and then dot then response, I'm going to do something like this. I'm going to say const response equals to await that. And now I'm going to grab, you know, just so I can like separate it, I'm going to, I guess, put a semicolon at the end here. So now what's happening, we're just going to keep refactoring the stuff at the bottom. It looks like I'm waiting on this response. And then once I had that response, I could do something with it. So what I'm going to do with it is this. So whatever was in the body of the dot then, I can now I can now just call it as if I waited on it. And it really is behind the scenes the same exact thing. And that makes it even easier to do stuff like this, where now I don't have to return. Instead, I can say, okay, you know, I could say response 2, or maybe I would want to reuse that variable response. So once again, I'll say response is equal to await this next thing. And then what I do in response to that next thing, so I'm getting rid of these like one by one. What I do in response to that next thing is just this. So look cleaner when we're all done. Okay, pretty good. And then the only thing I don't have are these, the dot catch and the dot finally. We'll handle the dot catch in a second, but I'll just set this at the end. I'll set loading at the end. Okay. So what this does now is we have this big function here, async function search. We call it immediately, but now it looks a little nicer in that I'm like, waiting, seemingly waiting on this response, then doing something with it, then making another response, then doing something with it. And then when I'm finally done, setting loading to false. And behind the scenes, this is still all a promise. The syntax just makes it so it looks cleaner. You're saying any reason to use async await over dot then? That's what Don is asking. Like I said, just syntax sugar. So if you think it looks nicer, that's the only reason. The dot, it really behind the scenes, it still is just the dot then and the dot catch. Sometimes it is easier to work with promises. But this is async await is something that we notice students use whether we teach it or not, because it's a cool looking feature. So we feel it's important to teach it. So let's just see that this still works. Does not. So it says it can't return anything besides a function. What am I returning right now? I saved this, right? Why is it upset? useEffect must not return anything. Oh, I think it's because of this line over here. Doesn't quite like this. So let's pull this out. And let's instead.
I think it's because you left async and where you first started that.
Okay, let me check that as well. So what I'm doing right now is just pulling out that logic of saying, don't even run this unless, that isn't true. Let me just see, have I solved the problem? No, I have not. So where were you saying I did it?
You left it in your useEffect, yeah.
Yeah, okay. So that what I just did was probably not necessary, but right. So now this is working, and if I say 555, we wait and it works. So it has the exact same logic, but I didn't quite set up the dot catch stuff. So if I do 1009, if I remember that works, but if I do 1010, what happens? Okay, it's kind of like stuck now. Why? So I come back here. I mean, let's just remember our network. That first one, 1010 worked. It was 1011 that didn't work. So coming back here, what happened? Well, this response happened. I waited it. It came back. This happened. Then this response, this access I got happened, but it had an error, right? And because it had an error, the function breaks right here. And so set loading false never happens. The good news is there's a way around this. And what we would use is a try catch block. So try catch is another thing that's in JavaScript and it can work with this. What we're going to do is first we're going to wrap this in a try. So everything we want to happen successfully, which I'll end over here, we will wrap in this try block. And by the nature, let me comment that out right now. Doesn't seem, I would expect it to, okay. So this is my try block, and I'm saying first try to do this stuff, but if there's an error, catch it. And we're going to call that error it catches catch. And what we want to do in that case is whatever we have here. So I can get rid of that. And then the try catch blocks catch block, the try catch block itself has a thing called finally. So we have that as well. And that's where we would finally say set loading false. And now we have a full replacement for promises using a single wait. And it does look a little nicer. So let's just make sure that works. Coming back here, I can do 1009 again. And that works like expected. And if I do 1010, it fails like I expect. I think it only has that because of what it had last time. If I refresh this and I do 1010, it's empty. Yeah. Okay, yeah, so that is a single wait. Cool. So that's everything I wanted to teach you today. There's definitely stuff in the main document that we did not cover. So let me X this out right now and I'll come back here. So ignoring the plan, if I look at React useEffect, there is stuff in here we didn't cover because it really builds things up step by step. Feel free to read this stuff, but I think what we covered is more essential because we saw more practical stuff. Jake, I can share all my code with you. I believe actually, if I were to open this whole folder, let me just open the whole folder. If you look at examples, there's already this file, useEffect example. If you go in app here, I actually broke it down where I have, useEffect basic. So we can see what that looks like. I'll comment this one out. So useEffect basic will, I have to npm run dev this thing. So if I go into useEffect example, it should have some stuff there. So let's go to 5173. Is this even working? Oh, I see. I must just be printing something out in response. So we have a couple of components here that do everything I was talking about. So we can just look at them, but useEffect basic here is just making that basic request. Pokey viewer is going to make a request once. And I think what I'm showing here is, the loading stuff. And I think the way I did it is that I got more than one image. Right, yeah. So if I comment this out, comment pokey viewer in, oh, I have more than one. Okay, so this will, be fed something based on the prop. Pull it back here. So that gives us a page like this, and you can see how that works. And then commenting these out, pokey search is closer to what we did today, where I can say Squirtle. And we'll see that over here, pokey search. It's going to have this process. And then finally, oh, sorry, that was pokey search a single wait. So pokey search is going to look more like this. And then I refactored that to pokey search a single wait to show the a single wait approach. So that's all available currently in the useEffect example, which is in the examples folder for day 3. Before we're done though, let's actually look at this assignment. I apologize in advance. It's probably going to be not dissimilar from yesterday where, I will come around and be trying to help, but we're going to do some refactoring and that can be annoying. But we're going to try and use useEffect ultimately. There we go. So I'm going to copy this. And I'm going to close this so that I can do something like this. Okay. So here's my part 3. I'll go into it. And I guess I'll open up the whole thing so we can see it. Then the first thing I'll do is npm install. And then I'll do npm run dev. And I believe I included Axios for you. I did. So all the dependencies you need are already there. Let's open this up. Okay, so this is what my video store looks like right now to start. And as you see, it's broken. The reason it is broken is because if I look at the inventory as it exists right now, the inventory has copies available and total available, and that's unique to us, but it has this weird looking ID. And the reason it has that is because we want you to make requests to this API that, is not our API, called OMDB API. And this is similar to what, forget who, but I think Kelvin did earlier that he showed us Monday, which was too advanced, where he was using, some backend API. So if I look in the README here, I'll see that we mention this. We say like we want to go to OMDB API, and if I copy all this, I can go to OMDB API. Where did I have that? Let me put that here. So I can go to OMDB API, just like Poke API. And this first thing is an API key. Some APIs do this. It's like a security thing, but you can just use the API key we provide for you. But the second thing is that ID. So now I'm going to grab this ID. Say I'll grab this one. And that is going to be provided here under I. So like I being inventory or ID, I don't know. I'm going to put that in there. I'll hit enter. And this is what it returns to me. It returns some JSON that's a little hard to read, but you see it has title, Shazam, rated, etc. And it has all the data you want. But of course, that's not what the data used to look like. So there's two things we ultimately want to do here. The first is we're going to make these requests, and we're going to have to use those requests to update what our, use state inventory looks like. And I said some stuff here that you might find useful for that. And I think actually when we come back, I'm going to explicitly show you this because it's a little complex. So let's actually do that do we come back 1:30 or 2? The question.
I think if we're starting, yeah.
Because when I look at my calendar, it tells me that everyone, comes back at 2, but you actually come back earlier, right? Or no?
We usually left earlier too, but we went off the calendar. So I think going off the calendar is the standard.
Okay, so if we go off the calendar, let's return at, well, I'm getting different answers. Della says 1:30, Katie says 2. It's very hard to, who do you trust, Della or Katie? They're equally trustworthy. So it's what do I do? I could always ask Nick. I promise you Nick will say earlier. So why even ask? Well, Katie's saying she's not trustworthy. Okay, Katie, you're selling yourself out. And I will open breakout rooms right now. Good point. So if Katie's not trustworthy, it looks like we're coming back 1:30. How about this? The first thing I'll do is, first things first, let me open the breakout rooms, which is a really good idea in general, to open them right away. So I'm opening the breakout rooms. You should be able to join these yourselves, right? If not, let me know. Can you?
I don't see the breakout rooms yet.
Okay, yeah. So I always forget this, that the first thing you have to do if you open Zoom again for the first time is select the option, allow participants to choose room. Now you should see all of them, right?
Yes.
Great. So today you're working in your groups again. So just join your groups room. What I'm going to say is that at 1:30 CST, we're going to come back. You can miss this if you want, and I will record it as well. How about? But what we're going to do at 1:30 is I will with you walk through this process, because I feel like you probably have to see it. You're going to get tripped up because what we're going to be doing is taking inventory.json as it exists. We're going to use this ID for each one to make a request. And then the data that comes back, we will merge it with this existing data. And the reason why we have to do that is because some of that data is coming from OMDB API. Some of the data is unique to us. And this is actually what you would probably end up doing in the real world. In the real world, it wouldn't be inventory.json. We'd ultimately have our own backend, which we will eventually get to. But the idea is some of the data comes from our own backend. Some of the data, we're getting it from somewhere else. And we're going to want to merge all that together because this way, we're a video store. We care about copies available and totals available. Whereas OMDB API can handle, knowing about a specific film's title and its poster and the detail and the description of it and the rating. And so that way we're not having to, create all that data ourselves. We're leveraging someone else's stuff, but, we do have our own unique thing, which is because we're a rental company. We want to keep track of this. So that's going to be part of it. And then the other kind of difficult part is this, which if I look at inventory item as it exists right now, you'll notice that I'm referencing things like title, image URL, copies available. Well, that's not what they're actually going to be called on OMDB API. If I look at what I got back from that, it's still called title, but it's capital T, and rating is now capital R rated. And the image isn't called image, it's called like poster. So it's similar, but it's not exactly the same. And so that's another thing to work through. But yeah, it's already at noon now, so we're done with class now. Let me stop recording.